It began slowly, innocuously, although the first appearance was quite sudden. There was no warning, no dent. It was just there, as if the small little hole had always belonged on my calf, as though it had always been there and always would. I first noticed it, and, after a quick moment's inspection, I thought that I should visit the doctor soon. Then, I went about my day, and it promptly left my mind. The next time I noticed it, I chided myself for not making an appointment, and once more thought to do so. However, this time, it seemed fascinating, sickeningly so. On the outside of my left calf was this small, although rather too large, hole. It was perfectly circular and completely black. It was as if no light could penetrate it. I studied it for hours, twisting this way and that, trying to see if there were more. I even used a torch to try and find what the cause was. The hole was too deep to see completely into. What I could see was regular looking skin, and the rest faded into shadow. There was no redness, no swelling, and no pain. Once I had satisfied my morbid curiosity, I went to the phone to call the doctor, but on my way, it slipped my mind. One moment I was striding confidently, if a little panicky, towards the phone. The next, I stopped, paused, and wondered who I was going to ring. It seemed every time I saw it, I immediately remembered, but once it was out of my sight, it left my mind. This went on for a few days. Then another began to appear. I could see a small dent, perfectly circular, and watched as over a few hours it deepened. It happened imperceptibly. I was only aware of it if I looked away and back again. But curiously, each time I looked away, I momentarily forgot what I was looking at. They were completely erased from my mind. I can think of numerous times I glanced at my calf and saw nothing but smooth, slightly hairy skin. It was a week before I noticed them again. This time, there were 7. They had taken on a slightly honeycombed shape. Thin walls of skin separated each one. I used a magnifying glass, but could not discern their cause. The only thing I was sure of was that they were there and they were not paws. When I next saw them, I was shocked and horrified. I counted 15 and what appeared to be 3 more. Their overall honeycomb shape became more apparent. I stared at them for hours, moving this way and that, seeing how they would react. They seemed to compress slightly if I stood, as though, weakened, they could no longer support my weight. I went to bed, troubled, but unsure of what. I had written down, "Call a doctor about your calf now," on a piece of paper. But when I looked at it again, the writing was scribbled out, obscured by thick, black marks. When I awoke the next morning, I felt a strange sensation in my calf. Swinging out of bed, I glanced at the sheet and saw a strange, yellowish liquid that had soaked into the sheet where my calf had rested. This residue seemed sticky, almost mucousy. The area around the holes had a sheen, and the skin was also coated. Counting, I found 34. I tried not to gag at the sight. The sensation returned, more uncomfortable than before. Quickly, I grabbed the flashlight and tried to see what it was. but I still could not penetrate the depths of those damn holes. Quickly, I looked for something, anything that was thin and long. I noticed that as I walked, my left leg seemed to sink slightly as my weight was put on it, like a spring under pressure. Finding a thin needle, I carefully pushed into one of the holes, slowly so as to not accidentally stab myself. It went deeper. The golden yellow liquid oozed around it, becoming thicker and faster flowing the deeper the needle went. Finally, it stopped. However, I could not feel the tip. I could feel the sides of the needle, but nothing else. I pushed it further and felt something writhing. Slowly, ever so slowly, I pulled the needle from my flesh, dragging more of that disgusting goo with it. A slight smell of rotting fruit filled the air, vile, but with a sweetness to it. As the needlehead left my flesh, I retched and vomited. On the end of the needle was a small, black worm, wriggling as it died. As I watched the creature that had lived in my leg squirm, I realized what the sensation was. It was coming from each and every one of those holes. Something was inside each one. Something was squirming in each one. Something was burrowing deeper in each one. Shudders pulsated through my body as I tried not to vomit again. I stared at that tiny, dying creature, unable to look away. There was no time to think, only to act. I made my way to the kitchen and, grabbing a sharp knife, sat down and set to work. First, I cut through the tiny pockets of skin, allowing the holes to become one. Then, I dug out each and every one of the vile creatures. The deeper I dug, the more I found. Blood had begun to flow freely and fill the hole I had created. I limped to the bathroom, barely able to walk. As I sat on the side of the tub, I grabbed the hose. I could feel them inside me. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, all gorging. Turning on the water, I rinsed the wound clean, clearing my field of vision. As the blood cleared, I saw them, a writhing mass living inside me. Occasionally, one would fall from the group and, squirming, would be washed down the drain. At first I used a knife to try and remove them, then my fingers. I felt something sharp bite into my hand. One of them had attached themselves to the tip of my index finger. With a shout of horror, I cut it away from my flesh. I carefully cut until I found tissue. Then I began to saw, hacking away, trying to remove as much as I could. Clumps of those insidious things fell from my leg. My vision grew cloudy, and shooting stars of red and black flashed across my eyes. I knew I was going to pass out soon, and still I tried to work, faster and faster, trying to finish the horrific job. I remember breathing deeply, then darkness. I awoke in the hospital. An untold amount of time had passed. The delivery man had looked inside my window to see if I was home and had seen a trail of blood. He had called the police. I tried to explain my actions to the doctors. They didn't understand. There was no trace of those creatures, but I can still feel them. I can feel them advancing, burrowing deeper and deeper. gorging on my flesh, thriving in my warm body. Soon, they will burst forth. I will have to stop them. Somehow, I will. My grandfather was a kind, generous man. He was the type of grandfather who would slip you a sweet or a biscuit after your parents had already said no, with a quick wink and a finger to his lip. The kind of old man who'd roll up his sleeves and get stuck in helping your dad fix the car or put some shelves up, even well into his 80s. A slight stoop, a shock of white hair, and deep throaty laugh are the things I remember most clearly about him. That, and his penchant for smartness. You never saw him without a shirt and tie, a sports jacket or suit, and braces rather than a belt holding up his trousers. Just occasionally, he'd freeze up. I don't really remember when I first noticed it, and it was really bizarre. One minute, he'd be chatting away happily to my mum and grandmother, a mug of steaming tea in his hand, and the next, he'd just stop, frozen in time, and his eyes glazed over. Even more weirdly, the conversation would continue to flow around him, as if nothing had happened. A few minutes later, maybe up to half an hour, he'd unfreeze and rejoin the conversation, his tea now cold and forgotten. He drank a lot of cold cups of tea. I asked my mother about this once, and she told me that sometimes Grandad froze up because of what he had seen in the army, and that it was a medical condition known as shell shock. I didn't really understand what that meant at the time, but it seemed a suitable answer to my young, inquisitive mind, and I pursued it no further. Like many of his generation, he'd been to war. He didn't talk about it much, but I remember once seeing his medals in a drawer, tarnished and gathering dust, and I wondered why he didn't take better care of them. I found out later that, like many young, idealistic men, he'd volunteered in the summer of 1914 and been sent out to France as part of one of the new service battalions 2 years later, in time for the great reaping of souls known as the Battle of Somme. I snuck in once, years later, and pulled out the medals so that I could take a look at them. There were 3, a bronze star with 2 swords across it, a silver one, and a gold one. There was also a dull bronze strip, about 2 inches long, but very thin. I wondered what the medals were for, and as this was the days before Google, I had to go down to the library to look them up. The librarian recommended a stuffy old tome with dull black and white pictures, but it depicted quite clearly the medals I'd seen in my grandfather's drawer. According to the book, they were the British War Medal, the British Victory Medal, and the 1914 Star, irreverently referred to as Pip, Squeak, and Wilfred, the standard campaign medals awarded to most British servicemen serving from 1914. I found myself slightly disappointed that they were not issued for some heroic deed, but I still wondered why he'd shoved them in a drawer and forgotten about them. Then, I remembered the bronze strip and flicked through the book in the hopes of finding an illustration. Sure enough, there was a picture of a similar strip. According to the book, this was a wound stripe, awarded to soldiers who'd suffered an injury in battle. Suddenly, it all made a lot more sense, and I realized why he didn't like to talk about it with us. It also made sense why he'd occasionally freeze up. I assumed it must just be to do with the wound. My curiosity satisfied, I left the matter and soon forgot all about it. That Christmas, because I was 16, my dad let me have a few drinks with Christmas dinner, and afterwards the men sat around the table with a glass of port and a cigar and told jokes, talked about world affairs, and generally enjoyed themselves. This was the first time I'd been invited to stay, and it felt like a real privilege, being treated like one of the men. My mother, grandmother, and aunts left the chat in the kitchen and wash up, whilst my sister and cousins went into the lounge to play with their new toys. We chatted, joked, swore, and laughed, having a great time just being men. No wives or kids within earshot. I really felt I was really part of something. Uncle Bob had just finished telling a risque joke about a barmaid when Grandad spoke up. "When I was in the war." We all turned to him, our laughing subsiding, prepared to listen to what he had to say. I learned later that after a few drinks, he'd occasionally start reminiscing about his war days, but never when Grandma or any of the kids were around. They were usually about some of the pranks they'd played on the sergeant or a drunken night on leave. This story was not like those. One night, the sergeant told us we were going on a night raid. Usual business, up over the parapet after dusk. Quick recce of the enemy lines, and maybe snatch a sentry for interrogation and unit identification. The brass always wanted to know who we were facing, as if it was a new unit or a reserve one, it might be worth planning an attack. I got tooled up with the rest of the lads, rifles, bayonet, and some ammo in pockets only. None of our usual marching kit, as it might get snagged on the wire or make a sound and give us away. I was the number one on the Lewis gun, a big heavy bugger, far too unwieldy to take on a raid, so I was just carrying my Webley revolver and a trench club I'd made by hammering hobnails into an axe handle. The thought of this made me feel slightly queasy, as I'd seen the photos of trench clubs in the library book. Evil-looking blunt instruments with vicious spikes. It's difficult to contemplate how someone as kind and gentle as my grandfather could have made one of these for the express purpose of breaking bones and caving in skulls. We went forward through the churned earth, past the corpses of Jerry's last attack. I remember my mate Harry slipped on some poor bugger's entrails and swore under his breath. The sergeant gave him a properly dark look for making a noise, and we all smiled, thinking about the bollocking he'd get when he got back to our lines. We were all bricking ourselves of fear. You always did when you went out on a raid, so anything seemed funny at that point. When you see your mates die every day, when a shell, a bullet, or a bomb could kill you at any moment, you learn to live with the fear. You get used to it. But stepping out onto no man's land, that's another fear altogether. You feel naked, alone in the universe, and it feels like every sniper in the German army is drawing a bead on you, getting ready to blow your head off. It's enough to drive a man mad. All talk had ceased round the table at this point. Everyone was listening, enraptured by my grandfather speaking. He didn't sound like an old man anymore. The passion in his voice was the clear tones of a younger man. He was staring into the middle distance as he spoke. He'd frozen up earlier in the day, when my sister had squealed when she received a Bunty annual. His face was the same now, except for his mouth moving as he spoke. This time, it was even worse. We all felt it. A cold fog had rolled in over no man's land, which any other time would seem like a blessing as it masked our movements from Jerry. But that night, it seemed ominous, malevolent. We kept moving forward. We couldn't see the enemy lines through the fog, but we knew they were close, so we kept low and slow. As we moved up, I began to see a shape emerge from the fog. The sergeant saw it too and waved us down into a holding pattern. We all drew a bead on the shape. After a few moments, we got the nod and began to move up. As we got closer, we began to make out the shape of a man. He didn't seem to be doing anything, just standing alone, staring at us. I'm not prone to superstition, but it was bloody creepy. I looked at the Sarge, and he nodded to me. Damn, I thought, I've got to investigate. I stepped closer and began to make out a little more. He was in a Jerry uniform, with one of the old spiked helmets still on his head. I began to make out the features on his face, and I could swear the bugger was smiling at me. I took another step and felt something shift under my feet. I nearly peed myself. I then looked down to see what it was, as I didn't want to take my eyes off what was in front of me. Another step closer, gripping my weapons with white knuckles. I suddenly noticed it. I nearly laughed out loud as the tension drifted away. He was hanging up on barbed wire, caught in the entanglements and dead as a doorknob. I'd heard the tales of this from some of the old sweats, men getting so entangled when they died that the wire kept them standing up. Feeling completely relieved, I carried on towards him. In my giddy state, I figured that the helmet would make a good souvenir. After all, this poor sod didn't need it anymore. I grabbed the spike, and his head fell back. He trailed away, and for a moment we thought he was having one of his moments. But then he looked directly at me, focusing for the first time, and I felt dread clawing at my spine. He didn't have any eyes, just two gaping holes, as if they'd been ripped out by something or someone. His mouth was twisted in a rictus grin, as if he was involved in some macabre joke. I felt the courage of the moment before drain out of me, and I dropped the helmet, which clattered on the ground. I'd seen a lot of bodies by this point, some of them close friends, but something about this one seemed different, wrong. The feeling of being watched crept over me, and I wondered if this was some new, evil trap the assholes had set for us. I wanted to crawl up into a ball and hide, but I couldn't let my mates down. I turned around to see where they were, but the fog was thicker now, and I couldn't see them anymore. I had to find them, let the sergeant know what I'd seen, so I began making my way back towards them. I looked back occasionally, a sixth sense not wanting me to look away from the corpse behind me. By this point, Grandad was staring back into the middle distance. I glanced at my father, but the look on his face told me that this was a tale he hadn't heard before, and the colour had drained from his face. I moved about 20 yards when I realised I should have come across them by now. I looked back, but the corpse had disappeared back into the fog. I was alone. I assumed that the sergeant had decided to call off the raid as the fog had gotten worse, and that they left me behind. Anger at being abandoned overcame my fear at this point, so I strode forward, determined to get back to our lines. I saw a shape ahead of me, and I assumed it was a rear guard of the unit, so I redoubled my pace, hoping to catch him up. As I moved closer, I realised he wasn't moving, and was instead hung up on the wire. With a sigh of frustration, I assumed I had been turned around in the fog and somehow made my way back to the corpse I'd seen earlier. I resolved to go and grab the helmet, so I'd at least have something to show for this whole mess. But as I approached, I began to feel that same sense of deep unease that I had before. As I moved closer, I realized why I was feeling so uncomfortable. It was a different man. Same pose, same sightless grin, but this man wasn't the German I'd seen before. He was wearing a British uniform. I vomited, not because he was dead, not because the blood seeping from the eye sockets was fresh, but because it wasn't just anybody. It was my friend, Harry. I felt sick. Harry had been on the patrol with us. How could he be strung up on the wire like this? I tried to pull the fat, rusty strands of wire off him, but all I succeeded in doing was tearing my hand. My club and revolver were useless, and I wished I had some wire cutters or even a knife. I fell at his feet and I wept. I had no idea where our lines were in the fog, and I was helpless to do anything for my friend. As I lay there, tears streaming down my face, I heard a shrill scream which chilled me to the bone. I was frozen in place, terror overtaking all other feelings. I could have been there for hours or minutes, I couldn't tell. Then I heard the scream again, and this time it triggered something in my brain. I got up and just ran. I didn't care anymore. I'd prefer a jerry bullet in my brain than let whatever was out there catch me. I felt like I ran for hours, stumbling over the shell holes and the detritus of no man's land. Eventually, I heard an English voice call out. I called back that I was a friend and stumbled into the front line trench. I was battered, bloodied, and worn from the wire and detritus I'd collided with on my run. But I'd never felt so safe in a frontline trench in all my life. I was the only man from my unit to ever return. My grandfather paused for a moment, long enough that we all looked at each other, wondering if the story was over. It had grown overcast outside, and it felt cold in the dining room, despite the fire crackling in the grate. The pause lasted so long, I was desperate for someone to break the silence. Just as it looked like Uncle Bob was about to break the spell, Grandad spoke again. 2 weeks later, we mounted an attack on the same sector. I took a round in my shoulder in the confusion and lay in a shell hole for a day before the stretcher bearers found me. Apparently, I'd lost a lot of blood and was swimming in and out of consciousness. When I came to, I had a hole in my shoulder, a bit of brass to say I'd been wounded in combat, and this. He pointed to a faded, white scar above his left eye. Something had tried to gouge out my eye. So my roommate, let's call him Sean, left school before the semester ended, and I thought this was rather strange, so I rummaged through some of his stuff and found a notebook. What I read was shocking. Here's what the notebook read. I've replaced names for privacy reasons. Well, I've never really written a diary or anything before, so I don't really know what I'm doing. But here goes nothing. Night 1. The concert was good, I guess. I'm not really into screamo that much, but Jack was good on guitar. So my girlfriend Rachel and I were taking everybody home. We came close to Rick's house and we saw a bright orange light up the night sky and smoke rising into the heavens. It was an extremely large amount of light and smoke, so naturally we went to check it out. We thought a house was on fire, that's how large it was. It was strange because there was no road that led directly to where the fire was, so we parked the truck on the closest street and proceeded on foot. As we got closer to the fire, we started to hear chanting. We couldn't tell what the chanting was saying, but it was deep and loud. I'm not sure why I got as close as I did, maybe to impress Rachel. But the point is, I got close. Too close. Every person chanting was surrounding the fire in a large circle, and they all appeared to be wearing the same robes, like monks. Anyway, I was at least less than 100 feet away from them. I held my phone up so that I could take a picture, but before I could take the photo, one of the men saw me, and in an instant, all of them were glaring at me, their hoods darkening their faces. Instinctively, I took off running and ran back to the truck and yelled, "Drive!" Immediately, Rachel floored it and we took off. They asked me what happened, and I told them that I thought they saw me. It was quite a scare, but I wasn't too worried. It's not like they know where I live. I went home that night, and at about 1 in the morning, I decided to hit the hay. This is when it began. I had a terrible nightmare. It wasn't anything gruesome or disgusting. It was just shocking. All it was someone in a cloak, like the ones I saw on the people by the fire. What I saw was this man in the cloak. All he did was stand there and stare. I couldn't make out any of the features of his face, just his eyes. They were pitch black, piercing, like they were staring straight into my soul. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Night 2. I had the same dream as last night. It was just longer this time. I felt like I wanted to wake up, but couldn't. It was like the man had trapped me. Night 3. I don't want to sleep tonight. I can't stand to have that dream again. I've been looking over my shoulder all day. I'll just drink some Red Bull and watch a marathon of Top Gear. Day 4. I might be going crazy, or maybe it's the lack of sleep, but I could have sworn I saw the cloaked man out of my chemistry window. Night 4. I tried to stay awake again tonight, but I couldn't. The lack of sleep got to me and I passed out. The dream was worse than ever. Same dream, same cloaked man. Just this time, there was a high-pitched squeak going on the whole time, and every once in a while, a deep laugh would arise, then fall as quickly as it had come. I can't take much more of this, and Luke is no help, since he's home for the long weekend. Night 5. I decided to have Rachel stay with me tonight. I don't want to face this alone. Once again, same dream, same man, same high-pitched squeak. Except this time, the laugh was louder and more frequent. I feel like this is some Freddy Krueger crap. Day 6. I saw him again. He was in the damn reflection of my bathroom mirror. I looked behind me and he wasn't there. God, I don't know how much of this I can take. Night 6. Luke's back, and I told him what had been happening. and he told me to just relax, that I'm overreacting. He's probably right. But why can't I shake this nightmare? Day 7. I saw him again today. He was across the street from me, just glaring. I know he was there because I stared back at him for a good 20 seconds. I think they're after me. They're gonna kill me. Night 7. I actually didn't have the dream tonight. It was worse. I awoke with a jolt in the middle of the night. I can't remember why, but what I saw nearly gave me a heart attack. I glanced at the window, and there, standing in the window, was the cloaked man. I looked away in fright, and when I looked back, he was gone. I have to get out of here. I'm going home. I can't stay here anymore. Day 8. I packed the majority of my things. I'll leave the dresser here for Luke, give him more space. I hope that maybe this trip back home will fix me. I think I just need to get away. Night 8. Luke invited me to a party tonight, but I told him I was too tired and I was going to get some sleep. I wish I went to that party. Luke stayed out all night, so it was another night alone. The dream came back, and it was just as bad as before. Like last night, I woke up in the middle of the night and looked out the window. Thankfully, there was nobody there. I jolted in fright when there was a hard, frequent, and frantic knocking on my door. I looked through the peer hole, and I saw Rachel, knocking and banging and screaming for me to help. I opened the door, and he was standing there. I was paralyzed with fright. Sorry if this seems really descriptive, but I will never forget that image in my head. He glared at me with his dark, piercing eyes for what seemed like an eternity. Then, in an instant, he released a horrible, blood-curdling scream and lunged at me, and then I blacked out. I woke up on the floor of my dorm room with the door wide open and a crowd gathered around me. And go figure, there he was, in the back of the crowd, glaring at me. Screw this. I'm grabbing my things and leaving for home. Screw this. I just can't take it anymore. That is the end of the notebook. This is Luke speaking again, and after I read this over a couple of times, I decided to do some research on this cult. I found nothing. But what I can tell you is what has happened since the incident, and what I've determined. Well, Rachel went back home as well. I guess she's not with Sean anymore. But there is a good reason for that. Sean never made it back home. For some godforsaken reason, he jumped in front of a moving train and killed himself the night he was supposed to get back home. I think his plan of escaping the cloaked man didn't work, and he just couldn't take it anymore. Here's what I've determined on the whole situation. There was no cult. I talked to Rachel and the others about the fire, and they said that it wasn't chanting that they heard, it was singing. And they also said they didn't get close enough to tell, but they said they couldn't see anyone around the fire. So I think that they were all figments of Sean's imagination. Maybe something happened to him in his childhood that sparked his mind to think up this disturbing cult. I'm not the best at research, so maybe I missed some key information about this cult. Any information you might have on this cult will be greatly appreciated. And on a side note, I'm pretty sure I saw the cloaked man in the hallway while I was getting a drink. Maybe Sean's notebook is getting to me. It was a typical workday for James. Susie was at her desk, sorting through her papers, trying to direct people towards their appointments. It was typical of her. Daryl was waiting by the water cooler, the cacophony of office chatter blurring together, individual words indistinguishable. Quite typical for him. Yes, it was all quite typical, except for the strange figure lurching in the corner of the office. It was in the corner furthest away from James, and he had to squint to even see him. But sure enough, the figure was there, standing still as stone, drawing no attention to itself. It was unnerving, but James figured his eyes were warping the frame of a rather tall co-worker, or maybe a coat rack with enough clothes to look human. He decided not to stare, in case he seemed rude, and carried on with his daily work routine for the rest of the day. His shift was coming to a close, so he readied himself for the journey home. To get home, James had to get to the ground floor, walk 2 blocks down to the subway, catch the train, and walk the last block home. It was all part of his lifestyle. The walk gave him some much needed exercise, the train ride gave him some time to plan out his evening, and the last walk gave him some time to be excited for whatever he planned. As soon as it was time to leave, James picked up his briefcase, waved goodbye to his co-workers, and headed to the stairs. Because he worked on the 3rd floor, he could take the elevator, but he often opted to walk down the stairs for his health. On the way down, something caught James's eye. It was only for a brief moment, but he knew he saw something. He couldn't quite tell what it was, as it was moving too quickly. James stood there, brow furrowed, but persuaded himself it was a co-worker who'd left before him. He walked down the stairs and breezed through the 2 blocks, which made him proud. Before he started his healthier lifestyle, that walk tired him out a bit. While on the train, James thought about what he'd do that evening to wind down. He decided he was going to watch a movie and cook up something nice to eat. He walked the rest of the way home and did just that. Dripping. The unmistakable sound of dripping pierced the silence of the room. At first, James only opened his eyes a slither, trying not to fully wake up. But as soon as his eyes focused on the wall, he realized the wall he was looking at was not from his bedroom. He jolted awake. He tried to sit up and look around the room, but couldn't. It felt as if he had a large weight keeping him down. He turned his head and saw his wrists were bound to the corners of what looked like a dirty, stainless steel table. Although he couldn't see, he knew his ankles were tied down in the same way. A loud click came from his right, so he cocked his head to see what it came from. An ear-shattering screech followed as a large metal door slowly swung open. The breeze from the door and the air that flew in from the dark room beyond it brushed over James's body. He became aware that he was stark naked. "Who's there?" James yelled towards the darkness. No response. He gritted his teeth in anger. As soon as he did, footsteps echoed through the room. A figure, standing just over 6 foot, wearing what looked like a tattered doctor's outfit, stumbled into the room in an erratic manner, grabbing the doorframe for balance. Whatever it was, it didn't have much sense of stability or direction. Fear stirred inside James. All of a sudden, the creature regained its composure and stood firmly upright. Now that it was still, James could finally see what the thing was. For whatever reason, it was wearing a dirty doctor's outfit. Clutched tightly in its right hand was a rather rusty and dull-looking scalpel. The left hand was still holding the doorframe, though just barely now that it was standing firm. Despite the scenario, despite the confusion, despite the dangerous weapon, what really sent chills down James's body was the creature's face, or lack thereof. Instead, all that could be seen was a grey, veiny layer over a humanoid-shaped head. No ears, no eyes, no nose, no anything. The creature hobbled its way over to James. All the while, James could do nothing but watch the thing slowly approaching him. He struggled against his binds, but the noise created only made it easier for the thing to head towards him. The creature slammed its left hand down on the metal table, the sound resonating through James's ear, making him cry out in pain. In sporadic and jerky movements, it moved its hand to the edge of the table and used it to guide itself lower until its face was level with James. Silence fell. James tensed up so much he stopped breathing. Chilling moments passed. It didn't take long before the need to breathe far exceeded his need to stay quiet. James let out a huge gasp, followed by a sharp inhale. The creature's face bubbled at the sound. A patch of skin ripped open to reveal a grey eye on the right side of its face. The eye darted frantically around. It seemed the creature didn't know how to use it properly, but it didn't take long for it to focus on James. James struggled against his blinds as hard as he could, but the edge of the rough ties tore at his skin. That didn't help him. The creature jammed the scalpel into the lower part of James's neck and ran it straight down to his lower abdomen. It felt like a line of cool liquid pouring down his body, before turning into a sharp pain, worse than any he'd ever felt before. The light of consciousness soon faded to black. Loud, unexpected beeping tore into James's ear, making him jolt upright. Adrenaline set in as the memories from earlier flooded his mind. Frantically, James rubbed his body where the knife went in. Nothing. He checked his wrists for marks. Nothing. With the klaxon of noise still blaring, James looked to his bedside table to see his alarm clock flashing the time 7 a.m. over and over. It was time to get ready for work. Hesitantly, James did so, his mind flicking back to what he now knew to be a nightmare, albeit a vivid one. It didn't take long for him to get his routine back in motion and head to work. The dream still played on his mind on his way to work. He thought over what it could have meant, or what could have caused it. Stress, maybe. As soon as he entered the building, James resolved that he had to focus on what was important at hand, and that was work. Through working and trying to meet deadlines, the whole event soon escaped James's mind. He was so enveloped in his bubble of numbers and Word documents that he almost missed that his shift was almost over, so he packed away his essentials and made his way out of the building. The fresh air was welcoming compared to the stuffy, stale air of the office, As it was nearing winter, it was already getting dark, despite it being just past 5 in the evening. Taking advantage of the fresh air, James slowed down for his 2-block walk to the subway. He decided to take in the surroundings, something he never really did for a place he'd seen too many times to count. To his right was a metal fence, blocking off a kid's playground. He thought the lack of kids would make the scene look desolate, but in the light of the moon, the scene painted a different picture in his mind. To his left was a chain of small outlet shops that were closing for the night. As a certain time hit, the momentum of the city and everyone in it shifted. And then he saw it. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable, but it couldn't be denied. Through the reflection of the adjacent shop, he could see a tall figure towering over him from behind. James froze, not knowing what to do. He started shaking until his adrenaline took over. Tensing, he spun around to confront it. Nothing. James released the breath he'd been holding and took in a few slow breaths to compensate. "It's just my imagination. It's just my imagination," James repeated to himself. "It's just my imagination. It's just my—" He stopped. He could hear the faint rushing of liquid. His eyes widened as he turned. A single eye stared back at him. The sound was the blood rushing within the veins of the creature's head. James dashed down the road, heading towards the subway. Soon he saw people, probably on their way home from work, and immediately felt relieved. The creature was nowhere to be seen. Still shaking, James took a seat in the train. No one was concerned or even bothered to see if he needed help, despite him showing obvious signs of mental trauma, typical train etiquette in the city. Hastily, James made his way home, knowing once there, he'd be safe. As soon as he stepped inside, he slammed the door and used all the locks. Satisfied, he shakily made his way to the kitchen to fix up any snack he could. So much adrenaline had left him a trembling wreck of his usual composed self. He rummaged around in his fridge and ate a few slices of bread, washing it down with milk. It wasn't ideal, but it was enough for now. James slumped down on his couch and lazily flicked the TV on. He barely had the energy to change the channel, so he ended up watching reruns of cooking shows for the rest of that evening. Eventually, the exhaustion got to him, and he passed out. Heavy eyes slowly lifted. It was still dark, nothing but the TV illuminating the room. Out of a curious instinct, James reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. 2:14 a.m. He attributed his sudden waking up to the twisted position he was in on the couch. He peeled himself off and turned to shut the TV off. The face of horror stared back. The creature's pale eye blinked, and the figure moved off screen to reveal a backdrop of static. James stopped breathing. He didn't know whether or not to turn the TV off, and if he did, would the creature go away? But the TV was the only source of light in the room, and if it went off... A few moments had passed, and James was satisfied that the thing wasn't coming back. With haste, he flicked on the light switch and turned off the TV. For the rest of the night, James lay in bed with the lights on. He didn't get much sleep, and when he finally did, it felt like a mere blink before his alarm pulled him back. He pulled himself off the bed as if weighed down with bricks. Groggily, he went on with his morning routine. He took some warm coffee and a cold shower, but soon enough he was sprightly and awake. The rest of his preparations were easy after that, and that's what James focused on, trying to take his mind off things. James arrived at work, the usual 15 minutes early, which, considering his circumstances, gave him a sense of achievement. It didn't take him long to settle in at his desk and get his head into his work. A few hours into the morning, the night's escapades started to catch up with him. It was as if he had a weight stapled to his eyelids. Out of more reflex than choice, he kept rubbing his eyes, only making the tired feeling worse. He knew that leaning on his arms wouldn't help, but a subconscious part of him disobeyed that fact. His head drooped lower and lower and lower. But just before he fell asleep, he stood up. He didn't care how much of a fool he made of himself. He pranced on the spot, getting his blood circulating and his heart rate up. After a good 30 seconds of movement, James decided to inspect the room, to see how embarrassed he should feel for his strange behaviour. Shoulders relaxed and head dipped slightly, he turned to face his peers, only to see an empty room. Abandoned chairs were pulled out from under desks, computer monitors still illuminated with half-finished work. A slight beeping could be heard, the unmistakable sound of a phone left off the hook. Was this some sort of out-of-place joke? Did he somehow miss a fire alarm? James slowly circled the office. An investigation had to be done. A quick glance at a few computer monitors showed no signs of why anyone left, just emails half-typed. James put the phones left lying on the table to his ear, but the other line was already disconnected. He had just leant down to look in one of the bins, desperate for clues, when a slight bump caught his attention. His ears pricked up, trying to catch any noise. A minute passed before another bump came from the break room. Maybe that's where everyone is, he thought. But if everyone's there, they aren't making much noise. Bewildered, James crept to the break room and peered inside. Empty. A noise, this time a scraping sound, shot from another corner of the office. It sounded like someone catching their leg on a desk. More cautious this time, James picked up an office lamp from the nearby desk, but held it at his side, trying not to look intimidating in case it was a colleague. He didn't want to get into any trouble and ruin his currently perfect record with the company. James navigated to the corner the sound came from. There, on the floor, lay a small scalpel. Judging by the shade of the tip, it had been recently used. He leant to inspect it, and a large figure pounced in front of James. It wore some kind of cheap navy blue suit, tattered from overuse. James stumbled back and over something, crashing to the floor. He clawed across the floor before regaining his footing and taking shelter behind Daryl's cubicle. He flung the lamp at the creature just as its eye focused on him. The lamp ricocheted off the creature's chest and into a computer monitor, shattering and sputtering sparks. The creature merely blinked. James knew it was futile to fight, so he broke into a sprint away from the creature. As soon as he did, dread filled his stomach. The exit to the building was on the other side of the office, in the opposite direction. Meanwhile, the flimsy office cubicle walls were falling as easily as paper with the creature bounding towards him. James knew he couldn't outrun the thing, which was now almost caught up to him despite his head start. James kicked his foot forward to shift his momentum hard and slammed his hands against a desk, trading a brief slice of pain to turn the corner fast. The creature didn't have enough time to react, instead tumbling into the cubicle just ahead of James's turning point. In seconds, it was back on its feet and dashing towards James. The fastest way to the staircase was over the cubicles ahead, but although it was the fastest, it was also very risky. James darted to the desk ahead and kicked off its lip, bringing the other leg up to carry him over the flimsy cubicle wall. As he did, the creature caught James's back leg, slamming him face first into the desk. The world spun around James as the creature, still holding onto his leg, dragged him off the desk, threw him to the floor, and pulled him even closer. James knew how this would end if he didn't do anything quick. Fighting the dizziness, he reached up and threw whatever his hand touched first at the creature. A bin filled with small bits of paper bounced off the creature's head. While it was distracted, James hit the hand gripped around his leg with 3 sharp kicks, forcing it to let him go. He jumped up as the creature recoiled in pain and crept around the desk, but it swiped at his back foot, causing him to stumble. James turned as he fell, landing on his own office chair. As he did, the chair turned slightly from the momentum and his elbows crashed onto his desk. A jolt shot through his body, and James's head shot out of his hands. Delirious, he stared around the room. He was back at his desk, sitting in his chair. Everything around him was normal. Everyone was where they were before, burrowing into their work, phones ringing in the distance, a normal office atmosphere. James sat there, stunned, dumbfounded at what he just witnessed, or thought he witnessed. It would be best to contain himself, so as to not cause a scene. His mind was already trying to convince itself that it was all a dream, but he had too many doubts. He took a deep breath through his nose, held it, and blew out of his mouth, following the standard practice of meditative relaxation. After a few more meditative breaths, he told himself he'd just fallen asleep. It was only a nightmare. The weekend started the next day, and that would give him enough time to recharge himself. All he had to do was get through this last day of work. James. The whisper came from just ahead of him. James peered around the side of the wall in front of him. What he saw chilled him to his bones. Fear incarnate. The creature that plagued his dreams, that haunted his life, was walking towards his cubicle. No one else was reacting to this. Everyone was going about their day like they couldn't see what he was seeing. James pulled back, heart racing, hoping it hadn't seen him, but it knew where he was. James pulled his chair to the back of his cubicle, maximizing the space between him and the creature in case it were to block him in. He knew if he overreacted, everyone would notice. He glanced around his small office space for something to hold, anything at all, for security. It was too late. The thing was now standing at the only escape point. James. A cold sweat ran down his head. He was exhausted. Too much had happened in too little time. He couldn't handle it. He picked up the nearest thing, a small cup filled with freshly sharpened pencils, and launched it at the creature. Pencils sprayed across its face and clattered to the carpet. He didn't wait to see how it affected the creature. He just curled up and broke down in the corner. The ambience of the office changed. Small mutters could be heard, whispers in the distance. Condolences were given, a chorus of, "Are you okay?" and "Do you need any help?" But they weren't being given to James. James looked up from where he perched himself. His boss, Amy, young but good at a job, clutched her face and moaned in pain as co-workers crouched over her. James's eyes widened as he realized what he'd done. He tried to stutter out an apology, but there was no way he could talk himself out of this. It wasn't long before he was climbing through different levels of authority, each prying into every detail of the case. The more he explained what he did, the more insane it sounded. Eventually, it was decided he was to be put on a week's leave without pay while they investigated the situation. The walk home was slow. James made his way back to his apartment, the feeling in his stomach getting tighter and tighter as he walked. He soon arrived at his house. Home is a place where one should feel safe and secure, but that wasn't the case anymore for James. He was anything but relaxed. The tightness in his stomach spread to his chest. The stress was getting to him. Yesterday's incident made James's urge to watch TV no longer viable, and despite eating very little over the past few days, his appetite was long gone. All he wanted to do was collapse. After inspecting his bedroom, he grabbed a chair and placed the backrest against the door handle to block anything from coming in. The bed beckoned him. He pulled his sheets haphazardly over himself and tried to let go, calm down, and finally rest. A ringing resonated through James's ears, filling him with confusion. It couldn't be his alarm. It was Saturday. His alarm should be turned off. But what startled him even more was that it didn't sound like his alarm at all. It was a continuous ringing tone, reverberating from a distance. James lifted his head. He'd been sleeping on a desk. One of those old wooden desks people were brought up on in high school. It even had the universal standard of rough graffiti, etched in with a sharpened object, messy and rushed so as to not get caught. He was in a dirty old classroom which looked like it had been abandoned by civilization. There were still teaching supplies haphazardly shoved to the sides of the room, and an old abandoned blackboard covered in a thin layer of chalk dust stood against one wall. James stood up, catching his legs on the desk. He squeezed through it, realizing he'd far outgrown his old school desks. He took a step forward, almost slipping on a dark puddle. It was too dark to identify what it was, but from the texture and smell, he knew it wasn't good. Creeping slowly, he made his way to the only exit. James was quiet, but the floorboards were not. Despite this, he took his time crossing the room. The door was already open, so he poked his head through. Darkness engulfed either direction, so picking a path was more a gamble than a strategy. Neither way looked enticing, but hoping luck was on his side, he went left. Using the wall as a guide, he made his way down the corridor. Even though it was some time, with a lack of usable senses other than touch, it felt like seconds before he was at the end. At this point, barely anything could be seen. The only clear visual was the light behind him from the classroom he'd just left. His hand was no longer touching anything, meaning there was a left turn. That was the direction he took, as it was the only direction he knew. The path down the turn felt darker than the path before. There was no longer a light behind him as a guide for a safe return. Soon an opening presented itself to his left. Guiding himself along the wall, he followed the turn, always keeping contact with his hand so as to not get lost. By this point, James's eyes had adjusted to the darkness, and he was able to make out shapes around the room. From this, he could tell he was in another classroom. If what he was sensing was correct, he was at the back of the room. There was a standard pattern of student desks in front of him, and a larger teacher's desk at the other end of the room. Whilst making his way around, his fingers bumped into something small. After a moment, he recognized it as a light switch. James was pessimistic of the likelihood of it working, so he haphazardly flicked it, not thinking about the consequences. The room was set ablaze by the influx of raw light. James got a snapshot image of the room before reflexively shutting his eyes. But what he saw stained his mind. There was one main colour of the image. It looked like fresh blood, smeared and splattered across the room at random. The liquid sank into the wooden furnishings, deep into the very grains of the wood. Neatly written in red on the blackboard was the phrase, "Feed me." But what really set James's adrenaline ablaze was what was sat in front of it. There, on the teacher's desk, in an old tweed jacket with mismatched stitched-on elbow patches, was the thing haunting his very existence. James forced his eyes open. Already the sensation was causing his eyes to water and lose focus. Despite this, James had figured where he wanted to go, and he didn't need to see clearly to get there. He swerved back through the door and immediately turned right. His eyes were now almost unable to see anything in the hallway due to the still imprinted image of that red classroom. James's hand grazed the wall for guidance, this time on his right. He ran so fast splinters of wood and paint chips sank into his skin, but it didn't matter. He knew what he needed to do. When the wall disappeared, James skidded and turned right, running toward the illuminated doorway. James made his way to the desk he woke up in and perched himself on the seat. There he sat, trembling and out of breath. Nothing. Everything fell silent. James furrowed his brow, confused, but he didn't have long to think. A sound was echoing slowly down the hall. Thud, thud, thud. The sound of footsteps grew nearer and nearer, in no rush at all. James looked down at the desk to see if it was the same one. It was. Thud, thud, thud. More footsteps. But then, silence. From the sound of it, the creature was at the door. James didn't know what to do. He thought to stand, but realized escape would be impossible. Instead, he stuck with his convictions. This is where he had to be to wake up. That's how it happened in the office. A hand gripped the door frame, and the grey head drew in, looking at James. Then, the creature did what James didn't expect. The sides of its cheeks twitched and slowly pulled up on each side. James stared in dismay, every second hoping he'd wake up. The creature didn't stop, and soon the skin around the mouth area began to stretch and then rip. A small split opened, and from inside came a small grumble, followed by a second split and a third. With each split, the sound grew. Soon, the split snapped and merged to reveal a mouth. Tears streamed down James's face as he watched. The creature, confused at first, opened and closed its mouth, testing it. After a few tries, the creature turned to James and smiled. James panicked. A last-ditch effort, he lay his arms down on the desk and rested his head on them, assuming the position he was in when he woke up as best as he could. James took a deep breath, held it, and released. Nothing. James took another deep breath, held it, and released. Still nothing. James raised his head. Warm air rolled across his face as the creature leant down mere inches from him, still grinning a mischievous grin, teeth sharpened to perfection, ripped skin hanging from its lips. Who are you?" James asked, shaking in fear, seeing no escape. The creature cocked his head to the side and, to James's surprise, growled back, "Somnio." "What do you want from me?" James yelled. The creature took in a raspy breath and hissed out, "Fear." James stared, silent, lost in thought as everything lined up. All the events leading up to now, all his decisions. All the while, the patch of skin where the creature's left eye should have been bulged, pulsing a few times before slowly tearing open. James's face relaxed and soon took on an odd smile, which turned into a large grin. A chuckle left his mouth, and before he knew it, he was laughing. The creature's smile dropped into what could only be described as confusion. Its recently formed eye was bloodshot and red, not having fully developed. A shocked expression then crossed its face. All the while, James laughed away. The creature's brow tensed as it grew genuinely angry. Its teeth clenched together. In one fast swipe, the creature plunged its claws into James's abdomen. James's chuckle weakened, but continued, as if he were a man possessed. The creature opened its mouth and clamped it across James's neck with animalistic speed. Time slowed for James. He knew he wasn't waking up from this, but he drew grim satisfaction from this last feat. He had severely ticked off this thing, the root cause of his pain over the last few days. With unnatural strength, the creature crushed his neck. And for James, the nightmare was over. From the day my daughter was born, I could tell that she was something special. We named her Zoe, and she was the smartest baby I have ever seen. Every single month, I loved my special little girl more and more. But for some odd reason, my wife distanced herself away from Zoe every single month. By the 6th month, my wife barely even gave Zoe a glance. I can tell it made Zoe sad, but I didn't really want to bring it up. I just wanted my daughter to know that I loved her very much. Zoe said her first word when she was 3 months old. Daddy. She never really said mommy or even mom, but my wife never seemed to mind. If anything, she finally looked to be in a much better mood. By the time she was 6 months, Zoe started to walk. She would still fall sometimes, but I was completely blown away by how strong-willed her young mind was. Instead of crying whenever she fell, she would just pick herself back up and continue trying. On Zoe's first birthday, my wife was busy with work, so I shared a very special day with my daughter. I got her a chocolate cake for her to smash and devour. She didn't touch it, but she looked perfectly happy with staring at the cake with a look of wonder on her face. We spent the rest of the day playing with her presents until it was her bedtime. My wife didn't come home until 10 p.m. I asked her where she was, but she just put her hand up to my face and walked past me and into our bedroom. I sighed and watched TV until I fell asleep on the couch. I woke up to the sounds of my wife and Zoe talking. My wife was trying to get her to say mommy, but Zoe kept clapping her hands while saying daddy with a wide smile on her face. That was the last time my wife tried talking to Zoe. On the day of Zoe's second birthday, my wife told me she was going to stay later at work. I tried begging and reasoning with her to stay, but she just told me it wasn't worth it. I heard sniffles from behind me when my wife left the house. I turned around to see a tear-stricken Zoe staring out the door. She asked me if Mommy didn't love her, but I just hugged her and told her that we both loved her very much. After I pulled away from the hug, Zoe asked me, "Why doesn't she talk to me?" I told her that Mommy was just stressed and to not let it bug her. I got her another cake, but she told me that she didn't like to eat cake. She thought it was too pretty to destroy. With a nod, I left the cake on the dining room table and took out 3 brightly colored bags from under the table. We have this tradition where I take out the presents for her and rip the paper as carefully as possible. She liked using the wrapping paper as little decorations for her room. The first 2 presents were just little bow sets and a couple of new books. The third present was one of those baby dolls you can feed and change. She was really excited about the doll. She played with it in the living room by herself until it was time for bed. My wife came back home at 11 p.m. completely drunk. She looked like she was crying, but I was far too tired to even acknowledge that she was there. She did it all of the time to Zoe, and now me. Our marriage was falling apart, and I really didn't know how to fix it. I thought she was just going to go into the bedroom, but she walked into the middle of the living room and picked up Zoe's new doll. After a couple of seconds, she started to hug the doll and rock it back and forth. The bottle and the 3 toy diapers were lying next to it, and my wife picked those up as well. She put the bottle up to the baby and started whispering to it. I was completely at awe at the sight of my wife showing the baby doll more attention than she ever gave Zoe. She sat down on the couch with the doll and took the bottle out of its mouth and continued to whisper to it. The whispering overwhelmed me with curiosity, so I snuck up behind her and tried to listen to what she was saying. It was hard at first, but after a couple of seconds, I noticed she was saying the same thing over and over again. "Please call me Mommy." After a couple of minutes, my wife fell asleep with a toy baby on top of her stomach. I walked into the bedroom and grabbed a blanket for her. After I got her settled in, I went back to the bedroom and fell asleep. This morning, I woke up to the sound of my wife laughing for the first time in several years. I rushed downstairs to see what the source of her laughter was. When I walked into the kitchen, I saw my wife twirling around in circles with a toy baby. Zoe was sitting down with tears falling down her cheeks. I picked up Zoe and asked my wife what she was doing. Each time she spun around, she just said one word at a time. "Just playing with my daughter." I told her that Zoe was crying, but my wife just shrugged and kept spinning around with the baby. This annoyed me quite a bit, but I just took Zoe back into the living room and played with a couple of her older dolls with her. After about an hour later, my sweating wife came out of the kitchen and said that she was going to the mall with her daughter. Zoe got up quickly and rushed into her room to change. By the time Zoe came out changed into her outside clothes, my wife and the doll were already gone. Zoe's bedtime rolled around and I put her to bed. While I put her covers over her, she asked me, "Does Mama really love me?" I nodded my head at her and smiled. I just told her that Mama wanted to surprise her with some new clothes. Zoe fell asleep a couple of minutes later with a tiny smile on her face. Tonight, my wife came home around 9 p.m. I walked up to her and asked her what was wrong with her. She tried to ignore me, but I kept blocking away until she stopped and glared at me. She shoved the baby doll in my face and shouted, "She's at least real. Do you know how hard it is to pretend with you? Zoe is dead. She's been dead. When are you going to stop playing this stupid game?" I shouted back at her to stop lying, but my wife just fell into my arms and started sobbing. Zoe came downstairs and stared at us hugging. She gave me a smile and walked back upstairs. I started to sob with my wife as memories started to flood in. Our beautiful daughter died 10 days after we brought her home from the hospital. There was nothing wrong with her. She just fell into a deep sleep she never woke up from. The doctor told us that it was SIDS, but I never wanted to believe it. After my wife finally settled down, I sat her on the couch and walked upstairs. I walked into Zoe's room and saw all of the little wrapping paper from her presents taped on the walls. The toys I got for her were there, and the new bed I bought for her just 2 months ago was there. But Zoe was nowhere to be found. With a heavy sigh, I closed the door to her bedroom and walked into my room. I looked through all the photos on my laptop that I thought I took with Zoe, but it was just me taking photos of myself. I was about to close my laptop down, but I decided to reach out to you guys. I'm now in the grieving process. My wife was acting crazy, but I was the crazy one all along. My baby is gone, and I just wish I could experience just one last day with her. In the more rural part of San Diego County, there is a place known as Proctor Valley. Proctor Valley is a large and mostly deserted area with only one road. Stories and reports of unusual sightings in this area date back almost 100 years. Strange reports began when cattle belonging to a local rancher were often found dead and mutilated. Other perfectly healthy livestock also died frequently, with no apparent cause of death. Some animals, including family pets, were found butchered in the aftermath of what appeared to be bizarre rituals conducted in the area. It's never been discovered who or what was responsible for these disturbing acts. The locals in the area became truly concerned when 2 children disappeared from a local rancher's home. The parents awoke to find their children missing from their rooms, and the rancher later found their tracks leading away from the home. The tracks led into the surrounding wilderness and simply disappeared without a trace. Search parties were organized, but the children were never found. Another strange case involved the Proctor Valley Bakery. The Proctor Valley Bakery was one of the first businesses founded in the area. The owner of the bakery moved to Proctor Valley with his wife and 2 children, and he opened his bakery soon after. He was successful, kind, and a respected member of the community. Until one day, he was found at home after having murdered his wife and children. The man was found on his knees, crying over the bodies. He was still dressed in his kitchen whites, which were covered in blood. He told investigators he had no memory of what had happened and simply woke up to find himself hovering over the bodies of his family. There are many who think the area is haunted by restless ghosts and demons. The truth is, there are some places in this world that are ancient and inherently evil. Proctor Valley is one of these places. Today, Proctor Valley is home to a small community and has one road running through it known as Proctor Valley Road. Proctor Valley Road is an old road that can take you between the cities of Chula Vista and Jamul, near San Diego, California. Over the years, many people have reported strange occurrences after driving on the road. There isn't much to see if you decide to drive there during daylight. You might notice a few ranch houses and abandoned buildings scattered along the side of the road, but not much else. If you're feeling brave, however, you can take a drive along Proctor Valley Road after dark. It doesn't matter if you start on the road heading east or west. The important thing to remember is, under no circumstances are you to stop along the road. In fact, before heading out, make sure your car has no mechanical issues and a full tank of gas. Beware, there have been reports of perfectly operational cars breaking down, although this is rare. You will most likely encounter things that will make you reluctant to continue driving. But once you decide to drive the road after dark, there's no changing your mind. Yes, it's entirely possible you won't encounter anything unusual on your drive. Many people have driven the road and reported nothing beyond a strange and uneasy feeling throughout the trip. However, if you do see anything unusual, don't stop your car. You may see things that cause you to feel concerned, confused, or even something that will terrify you. Just remember to stay in your vehicle and continue straight ahead. The road begins as a typical paved street. Before long, you will come across a sign indicating the end of the pavement, and the rest of your trip will be along a dirt road. Once you've gone that far, keep your eyes open and don't let anything distract you. Your phone will most likely lose signal once you reach this point. If you do have signal, you'll notice the battery life in your phone will decline rapidly. The first strange thing you might see is a lady in a blue dress. Sightings of the lady in the blue dress are the most commonly reported paranormal activity on Proctor Valley Road. You might see her standing along the side of the road, attempting to flag you down. You might also see her curled in a fetal position alongside the road. Whatever the case, ignore her and keep driving. The history behind the lady in the blue dress is unknown, but everyone who has encountered her has described a horrible feeling of dread. Many say she's no lady at all, but some kind of demon trying to convince you to stop. No one knows for sure, but under no circumstance are you to stop for her. If you decide to drive with your windows down, which I don't recommend, it's possible you will hear a piercing scream echo through the hills. Some individuals have reported their vehicle completely breaking down upon hearing the scream, and they were not able to start it again until the scream subsided, which can often take several minutes. If this happens, keep calm until you can start your vehicle again. Then, exit the area as quickly as possible. Do not get out of your vehicle. If you drive along Proctor Valley Road during a full moon, you might see strange creatures in the countryside. Some have reported sightings of a large beast they describe as similar in appearance to an ape. Others have seen large coyotes walking upright on their hind legs. Further reports indicate sightings of a large, furry bovine creature with bells attached to it, wandering the road. The Bonita Museum near Proctor Valley claims to have a cast footprint of this creature. You may also discover small handprints appear along your windows. Ignore this and continue to drive. I recommend you don't go alone if you decide to drive the road at night. There truly is safety in numbers. However, sometimes passengers will report strange occurrences happening with one another. One woman accompanied her sister and her sister's boyfriend during the drive. The woman stated she fell asleep in the back seat, and when her sister looked back to check on her, she was horrified to see a horned, shadowy figure with red eyes hovering over her. She stated she knew, without a doubt, it was the devil. Others have reported strange behavior displayed by their passengers. Even the calmest, most passive individuals have been known to act paranoid, aggressive, violent, or hysterical. Whatever the case, do not allow your passengers to distract you until you reach the other side of the road. The rarest and most terrifying thing you might encounter is what is known as the demon car of Proctor Valley Road. No one knows where it came from or why it inhabits the area. You might see headlights appear behind you, possibly as far as 1 mile away. Before long, you will find the headlights are right behind your vehicle, regardless of how fast you are driving. If you drive off the road, they will follow. You will have a very hard time outrunning it. The headlights will back off every so often, before suddenly moving forward to within an inch of your rear bumper. The headlights will move violently back and forth, and you will hear a horn honking at you repeatedly. Do not stop your car. Do not attempt to turn around. Keep driving until you reach pavement. Once you do, you'll see the headlights stop and turn around to drive back in the other direction. It will disappear into the night faster than you thought possible, and the headlights will no longer be visible. It's possible you'll encounter other strange things along the road that I didn't mention. Whatever the case, continue driving until you're on the other end of the road. Once you've reached pavement again, things should be back to normal. Throughout the years, there have been many stories of tragedy and terror stemming from Proctor Valley. Perhaps all the stories are just old legends, started by ranchers to keep people out of the area. Maybe none of the stories are true. Still, there's something inherently terrifying about Proctor Valley Road. something that awakens an instinctual prehistoric terror buried inside us all. Maybe it's best to be cautious while driving there at night, at least until you've reached the end of the road. "Gross, don't touch it," Judith whined, recoiling as George prodded at the fleshy lump in the side of the cypress tree with a sharp stick. Little Thomas spoke up from beside her, pointing at the thing excitedly and smiling ear to ear. "Look, it's moving!" Sure enough, their discovery twitched in response, the fleshy hole in its center slowly beginning to open and close. It was an odd thing. The children knew at least that much. From a distance, it had just looked like a flower on a tree, but when they had gotten closer, they had noticed its peculiarities. For one thing, it had a mouth, a fang-filled maw that had seemed dormant up until this experimental stick poking. That in itself was bizarre, but during the children's inspection of it, they noticed that the throat of the thing on the tree seemed to stretch on for miles, a grotesque tube filled with teeth, going on and on, longer than it had any right to. This discovery was quickly shoved to the wayside upon closer inspection of the large pink petals the thing had, the mouth hole resting in the middle of what looked like a pile of tongues, each with many white protrusions. It had been Judith to notice what exactly the white shards were. Human teeth, seemingly growing out of the flesh of this meat flower. Judith was cautious of the thing, as she was with everything she did not understand. But George and little Thomas were excited and curious about this new discovery, and there was no way she was walking back through the swamp alone. The boys laughed at the thing, enjoying the spectacle of the hungry maw twitching and burbling, some of the petals lapping at the air, many of the teeth retracting inwards. Every movement it made, Judith took a step back. It just looked wrong. She had always seen the same kinds of plants in the swamp outside the house, and there had never been anything like this in Father's flower book. Judith twirled a lock of brown hair in her fingers as George experimentally put the tip of the branch into the now gnashing gullet, dragging the pudgy, bespectacled child a few steps forward as the stick in his hands was chomped down on and pulled in violently. He shrieked, releasing the stick as the flower devoured it hastily, splinters of wood flying through the air at the force those many rows of razor-sharp fangs were shoving with every bite. Every one of the petal tongues lashed aggressively now, their many tiny teeth jutting out and wiggling violently as it mindlessly consumed the invading object. Little Thomas shrieked loudly, his shrill voice piercing the air and drowning out the sounds of slurping and chomping. Judith and George quickly following suit and taking several steps back, eyes filled with a sudden, immediate terror at the sudden threat to their lives. Judith pouted, straightening her dress before stamping her feet adamantly, shoulder-length brown curls bouncing angrily as she made clear her displeasure. "I told you not to touch it, George. I don't like it. I want to go home." George fixed his glasses, puffing his cheeks out grumpily and giving a pout straight back at the younger female. He folded his arms across his chest. "Fine, you big baby. If you're gonna be like that, we'll just leave you behind next time." "Yeah," little Thomas piped up, mimicking the pose of the larger boy beside him and giving a sneer in Judith's direction. She blushed red, then stuck her tongue out, taking a seat against another cypress and crossing her arms as well. The situation upset her, but not enough to warrant losing her playmates. George nodded at little Thomas and turned his attention back towards the unusual flower. He rubbed his chin for a moment, pudgy fingers brushing across pale, freckled skin as he considered what to do with their discovery next. It was hardly moving at all, dormant as it had been when they found it. Suddenly, little Thomas had an idea. "You want to throw rocks at it? Good idea!" The two boys beamed. Judith opened her mouth to speak, then went back to sulking. If they wanted to get themselves hurt, who was she to stop them? They didn't want to listen to her after all. George and little Thomas dug through the dirt and grabbed the biggest rocks they could find, the larger child rubbing his sweaty hands on his stretched cardigan before taking aim at the flower. The rock loosed with more force than George had expected, bumping against the petals hard enough to leave a bruise on one. The oddity howled in pain, its wails echoing throughout the forest, loud enough to force the children to cover their ears. The teeth covering the creature's tongue petals seemed to bare, dozens of them nearly in danger of digging their way out of the bumpy flaps entirely as they wiggled and squirmed. The flower furious at having been struck. The pink organs flailed and thrashed, hungrily, slurping more, jetting out a long black tendril from somewhere in its chasm of a throat, and thrashing it through the air wildly, desperately searching for whatever attacked it. Little Thomas yelped and threw his rock square at the flower, unable to think of anything else to do. Another gibbering howl sent the birds flying out of the trees, the long, shrill sound bringing Judith and George to their knees, hands covering their ears. The youngest amongst them was not so lucky, however, his gaze fixed on the black tendril, his ears deafened as he watched it slow its flailing, the tip splitting and peeling back to reveal a milky white eye. More dripping tendrils began to form off of the first, each one stretching out several feet before splitting to reveal eyes of their own. The monster's shriek had stopped, but little Thomas could still hear the ringing. 2 small pops, the only indication that the boy's eardrums had broken. His eyes trained on the curious, watching eyes, constantly multiplying as they slithered closer still. George called out to him, he thought, but his voice seemed a million miles away. One of the flower's tar-dripping tentacles surged forward, followed by what was now hundreds more, moving as a concentrated mass towards little Thomas's face, the boy's eyes spinning round and round. Many drove down through his mouth, shattering teeth as they filled up his stomach, others filling into his ears, into his eyes. They moved clumsily, dragging him to the ground with some effort, before steadily pulling the new meal in closer. Oily tendrils caressed his brain, and both Judith and George screamed in utter horror as they watched their friend smile, tiny hands clawing at the dirt as if trying to get closer to the thing on the tree, his eyes a pure white and his skin pale as death as he desperately flopped himself across the dirt. Sobbing and wailing, George grabbed little Thomas's feet and pulled, his once polished dress shoes becoming caked in mud and dust as he strained with all his might. The younger boy's legs flailed and kicked in retaliation, gurgling angrily and hugging the cypress trunk as if it were the most important thing in the world. One of these kicks landed its mark, catching George in the face and shattering one of his lenses. Judith, still shrieking and holding her hands over her ears in complete hysterics, little Thomas's happy burbles grew more frequent as he grew closer and closer to the flower, hands gripping the tongue petals reverently as he caressed the angry bone protrusions. They lapped at his little fingers, slathering them in a thick saliva as the tendrils forced his head into the gnashing tube of hungry teeth, leaking thick ropes of crimson down the ashen wood as little Thomas's skull was quickly crushed, beaming smile still plastered on his face as the flower began taking bites from him. Judith hyperventilated, curled into a fetal position, while George wailed, holding his bloodied nose. The sounds of slurping and breaking bone gradually faded, the two remaining children sitting in silence for several long minutes, even after the noises had stopped. It had been Judith who looked up first, streaks of tears running down her face, cheeks cherry red, and her breathing little more than wheezing at this point. The flower was gone, as was the tree it had been attached to. Even the stains were gone. It had almost been as if it never happened. They had never run so fast in their lives. My sister is an urban legend. I never liked those growing up, probably because of her. You ever notice how when someone tells an urban legend, it always starts out something like, "My brother's cousin had this girlfriend once who..." Yeah, sure he did. I think that's why people find urban legends fun though. Nothing bad ever happens to someone you know personally, of course, but it's still someone connected to you, a friend of a friend of a friend. That makes it real enough to be fun, but not so real as to be horrifying or tragic. The thing is though, urban legends have to start somewhere, and your dumb stories might not be so fun for the people who suffered the truth. Most people don't even remember that I had an older sister, much less who my sister was. Her name was Michelle, but everyone called her Missy. She liked baking a lot. We used to make cupcakes together. That's the strongest memory I have of her, and I hold on to it when times are tough, when people are talking, running their mouths without thinking twice. She always lets me choose what colour sprinkles to use. Isn't that nice? She was really kind to me, for an older sister. Missy was a full 12 years older than me. I was only 6 when she died. Missy had this best friend, Ava. Ava was nice too, and when she came over, she and Missy would let me play with them, at least for a bit. They never treated me like a nuisance. My memories of Ava are scarce. In my mind, I see flashes of black hair, and I can hear her laugh. She had this very distinct laugh, the kind that makes you happy just to hear. Anyway, Ava got sick when she was in high school. Leukemia. She was sick for a while, and then she died. I saw her once or twice in the hospital when she was still feeling okay. I wasn't allowed to see her at the very end though. But Missy went to see her every day. The day Ava died, Missy promised to keep seeing her every day, no matter what, and she kept her promise. After Ava's death, Missy used to drive to the cemetery every day after school. It was her senior year of high school, and she should have been out partying with friends, getting into all sorts of dumb trouble. But she wasn't. Instead, she spent every afternoon just sitting at Ava's grave. My parents encouraged it at first, but eventually they grew worried. "This isn't healthy," my mother told my father one night. They were whispering, but not quietly enough. I suppose they hadn't realized I was hiding at the top of the stairs, hanging onto every word. "It's not good for her. She's torturing herself over this. I think we should talk to her." My father was a man of few words, so each word he used was important. I knew that there would be no more daily cemetery visits once they'd talked to Missy, and that made me relieved. I too was worried about my precious big sister. Unfortunately, they never had the chance. That night, Missy was late coming home from the cemetery. My parents were worried enough when the knock came at the door. Missy never knocked. When we saw the police officer standing there, asking for Michelle Turner's parents, we all knew what had happened. The details came later. It was dark and slippery out. I remember that it was winter then, and ice was beginning to form on the roads. That was probably why my parents were so worried. Anyway, they think a deer ran in front of our old Ford, and that's why Missy swerved. She lost control and swerved the car into a ditch just outside the cemetery. They assured us that it was an instant, and she didn't feel any pain. My parents buried Missy next to Ava. I begged them not to. At the time, I couldn't explain why exactly that felt wrong. Now I know. It's because she should be buried with us when the time comes. But my parents felt this was what Missy would want. Ava's family agreed. So that's where my sister is buried, next to her best friend in Sandwood Cemetery. Perhaps that's why the legend started. A few months after her death, long enough that the town wasn't in mourning anymore, my family and I started hearing the stories about the two dead girls in Sandwood, how their mysterious deaths could never be explained. People came up with all kinds of crazy ideas. In some versions of the story, Ava and Missy were lovers, torn apart by death, only to be reunited in the afterlife. In others, Ava was jealous that Missy was still alive and ran a car off the road so they could be even, which is both ridiculous and stupid. In all versions though, Missy didn't roll a car by mere accident or coincidence. It was Ava's ghost or the face of death itself that did it. Or, and this one pains me the most, she rolled the car because she wanted to. Because she wanted to die, and that was the only way to make it look like an accident. I hate that version, because out of all the stories, it's the only one that could be true. It was a full-blown urban legend by the time I hit high school. People were never careful around me because they didn't realize Missy was my sister. People had long forgotten to include Missy's last name in the stories. Besides, we were 12 years apart. Most people just assumed Missy was an only child. But she wasn't. She was my sister. That's my sister people are talking about. It's a fun urban legend for most people. It's a terribly painful, terribly real memory for me. I never talked about Missy. I didn't want people asking me about the legends or bothering me with them. I simply avoided them or expressed disinterest if they were brought up. It was working pretty well until one day, near the beginning of my senior year, a couple of my friends, Sarah, Tom and Gregory, wanted to go out to Sandwood one night and begged me to join. "They say if you go out when the moon is full, you can hear the sounds of the two girls laughing together," said Sarah in hushed tones. We were killing time in study hall, and I wanted nothing more than to escape that stupid conversation. I remember rolling my eyes a little at her. Really? Why is it always a full moon? Honestly, some people are so unoriginal. But then I thought about Ava again. And a laugh. And I tried to think back to Missy's laugh and what it sounded like. But the thing was, I couldn't. I just couldn't remember. I was stuck on that sudden revelation when Greg and Tom jumped on board Sarah's proposal. "Why not? It's a nice enough night for it, and it's not like we're going to get another chance," said Tom. Greg nodded and added, "I'm blowing this asswipe town as soon as I graduate. Might as well take a good story from it, right?" Greg thought he was such a badass. Real edgy. Sometimes it made me cringe, but I still liked him. I really should have said no. I should have told them I had homework, or family night, or something. There were a million excuses I could choose from, because I didn't want to make a mockery out of my sister's death, out of all the pain my family had been put through at her expense. But her laugh. I couldn't stop thinking about her laugh. And even though I knew I wouldn't hear it, knew the stories were bullcrap. Yeah, I'm in. I had to take the chance. Greg drove. His parents were loaded and let him borrow any one of their numerous cars whenever he wanted. He picked me up last around 10 o'clock. I told my parents I was going to a study group and I'd be back late. They trusted me. They thought I'd moved on as much as I could from Missy's death. They really overestimated me. We drove out to the cemetery and parked on the side of the road, windows down so as to better hear the ghostly laughter. Everyone cracked open a beer, except for Greg, who didn't really drink. I think about Greg a lot nowadays. He was always pretending to be someone else. Not that it really matters now, I guess. We sat there drinking for a while, laughing and chatting about school. Sarah was practically bouncing in her seat from nervous anticipation as the night wore on. It was all great fun to them. A game. I was nervous too, but not the good kind of nervous. Instead, I had a vaguely sick feeling in my stomach, like something bad was about to happen, but I wasn't sure what. The feeling intensified around midnight. That's when we would hear the laughter, Sarah told me. Because that's when the veil separating life and death is lifted ever so slightly. That's when we can hear the dead. I didn't believe her. I waited for a sign from Missy since the day she died and never gotten one. I believe that dead is dead. No amount of wishing or hoping or sobbing in your bedroom while your parents drink themselves to sleep again will ever change that. I was musing on that when Sarah shushed us. "Hey, listen, do you hear that?" I thought she must be kidding. We all quieted down and listened. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves of the trees. For a moment, just one sliver of a moment, I thought I heard someone walking through the grass. And then it was gone. Tom snorted at us as he chugged the rest of his beer. "I don't hear any..." That's all he got out when the screaming started. It was all around us, like we were caught in some kind of freak storm, shrieking and wailing, the likes of which I had never heard before in my life. It was like a portal to hell had been opened, and we were hearing the voices of the damned. It was the sound of pure agony, and it was so loud that it shook the car. No, wait, it wasn't shaking the car. Something else was. The car was rocking wildly back and forth, so hard that Sarah and I were bouncing on the seat. I hit my head against the top of the car and cringed, my vision blacking out for a second. I could hear the screams my friends joined the voices outside as the car rocked violently. I was terrified for a moment that whatever was outside would shake the car hard enough that it would roll over. I took a second to think about that, about the car rolling, about my death, about what my parents would think when I died just like Missy had, when Tom's voice tore through the air. "Roll the windows up! Jesus Christ, roll the windows up!" My hand was on the window crank before I could even process what he'd said. I had the window up in seconds. Sarah, on the other hand, was curled up in a ball in the middle of the back seat, sobbing and rocking back and forth. I scrambled over her to close her window, trying to desperately hold my ground. The car was still rocking, back and forth, back and forth. A few seconds later, the engine roared to life, and the screams outside increased in volume. For a moment, the shaking got worse, and I was thrown to the floor. Then, Greg slammed on the gas, and we shot out into the night like the proverbial bat out of hell. I know, cliché, but it's exactly how we felt. The shaking stopped, the screaming stopped, everything stopped, except for Tom and Greg's swearing and Sarah's sobs. I was in the back seat, stunned and terrified, listening to the night wind as we left the cemetery in the dust. But just before we turned onto the main road, just before we left sight of the cemetery for good, I could have sworn I heard someone calling my name, in the voice of someone who had been dead for 12 years. That night ended our friendship. It seemed like a big deal at the time, but looking back, most high school friendships are doomed to fade into obscurity. We would have drifted apart sooner or later anyway. It was just the fact that it happened so suddenly that made it hard to swallow. But maybe it was for the best. Our experience became a part of the legends. We didn't hear stories about mysterious laughter anymore. Instead, we heard stories about screaming and shaking and hell. I chose not to listen to them. I didn't want to anymore. I just wanted it all to go away. But things like that don't ever really go away, do they? It's been many, many years since I graduated and left my hometown. Many years since I've been to Sandwood and put flowers on my sister's grave, praying and hoping that I would wake up and everything would be one big nightmare. I don't have nightmares anymore. Nothing in my dreams can be worse than what I've seen awake. It's the 30th anniversary of my sister's death this year. My parents want me to come home for a death date. They want me to visit the cemetery with them. And I know I should. I know it's important to them, and it's my duty to them as their child. And yet, I find myself hesitating as the season draws to a close, as the snow begins to fall and ice begins to cover the roads, because I'm terrified of the day when I return. I'm terrified of hearing my name whispered once again in the cold stillness of the cemetery, beckoning me to glance at what's on the other side. I've been homeless for close to 4 years now. No, it's not because I'm lazy, and it's not because I made bad choices, at least no more than the average person. Sometimes bad things happen to good people, but that's a story for another day. I'm writing this because I need help. I only have until they kick me out of the library to write this. They don't like us in here. Think we're trying to steal the books or something. I've seen a lot of things living on the streets. Things that you couldn't even make up. It's best to have a few companions that you can trust. People who won't steal your stuff and will share the limited resources they have. For me, that's Cooper, Dottie, and Oz. I won't go into how the lot of them ended up like me, but suffice to say, it's turned them into an old bitter bunch, much like myself. Cooper is only 30 and handsome enough to rely on his looks and charm to make a bit of money panhandling. Dottie, despite being in her mid-20s, looks no older than 16. People trust her. Don't see her as vermin like myself. Her game is pickpocketing. I don't necessarily approve of it, but I can't turn my nose up at the results. A man has to eat. Oz is the oldest of the group, but a whiz for MacGyvering whatever you might need. Ask Oz for something you need, she'll tell you the parts to bring her, and she'll rig you something better than store-bought. She also has a knack for stretching $1 and often manages to fashion tasty meals out of whatever we're able to scrounge up. Some people might refer to our ragtag group as a family. I would not. You get close to the people you travel with, sure, but it's purely out of necessity. Everyone in our pack has a role, something that benefits the rest of the group. I myself am the muscle. I may not be as big as I used to be. My diet doesn't allow me to get quite enough protein for that, but at 6'3", I'm an intimidating figure. Even despite my height, the scar across my right cheekbone, and the fact that I look angry regardless of mood is usually enough to deter people from messing with us. Oz and I have been a team since pretty much day one. She's been homeless most of her life and sort of took me in. She taught me the best ways to feed myself, where to sleep at night, and little tips and tricks like insulating your jacket with newspaper to keep warm, or what places let you hang out during the day. Cooper joined the team about 2 years ago when Oz found him getting harassed by police for sleeping at a bus stop. Dottie is our most recent recruit. She sort of found us, and like a stray kitten, has never left. Dottie has a special place in my heart. Never having had children, I almost think of her as my daughter. At times I almost act like a father, picking her up and carrying her around on my massive shoulders, or carrying her home after a long day of scavenging. The events leading to her losing her home would bring anyone to tears, myself included. But even though her life has been a series of pain and unfair circumstances, Dottie is my ray of sunshine. She has the sunniest disposition of anyone I know, always hopeful, constantly smiling. She truly believes that each and every one of ours luck will turn around, and for a moment, we thought hers had. Dottie was approached at the shelter a few weeks ago about career counselling. It's a new service that they're offering to homeless people who have shown potential, in the words of the staff members she spoke to. They would work with her to create a resume, help her reach out to potential employers, and provide her with a selection of donated clothing to help her look presentable. I'd never seen Dottie so ecstatic, which is saying something. The girl literally dances when we manage to get 2 meals a day. Dottie left to meet with her career counsellor 2 days ago, wide-eyed and grinning. She'd even used the bit of lipstick she saved for special occasions and was looking extra radiant. I'll admit, although slightly jealous, I was excited for her. She deserved to get out of the streets before they wore her down and stole her joy like they had mine. We expected her back a few hours later, but 5 passed before she returned to the abandoned subway platform where we stayed most nights. It had gotten dark out, and my protective instinct kicked in. Cooper and myself decided to head to the shelter to see if we could wait for her and escort her home, if they hadn't given her a bed for the night. It didn't take long to find her. She was wandering the street that connected the main street to the station. Something was wrong. She looked tired, her usual smile missing. We asked her how the counselling went, but she just sort of looked at us, like she didn't quite know our faces. It was disconcerting as hell, like looking a ghost in the face, rather than the happy girl we've known. We brought her home. She wouldn't follow us, but we were able to steer her through the station and down under the passageway that led to our spot. Entering the platform, our little crash site is nestled behind a bunch of crates and old barrier parts. Although our particular portion of the station is no longer used for boarding the subway, the train still runs past it, so it's wise to stay hidden. I could smell the soup that Oz was cooking on the camp stove. She had worked her magic again. Dottie didn't show any signs of recognition. Oz seemed even more concerned than we had. She demanded to know what had happened, but we didn't have many answers for her. She sat Dottie down and bundled her up in a hospital blanket before handing her a bowl of soup. Dottie took the bowl from Oz, but didn't make any move to drink it, just stared straight ahead, saying nothing. We tried to get her to eat, to speak, anything. We considered taking her to the hospital, but it's not like any of us had the money to afford a bill. Besides, they kill us in there. Oz concluded that the best thing would be to call it an early night and see if she got better by morning. I didn't like that, but there was nothing else we could think of to do. I stayed awake as long as I could, watching her. She didn't sleep, didn't even close her eyes, just stared ahead, barely blinking. Eventually, I couldn't keep my eyes open any longer and felt myself drift off to sleep. The harsh light of morning, seeping in from the street through the cracks in the stone walls, woke me. Groggily, I looked around to make sure we were all here and safe, as is my habit. Dottie was gone. My heart jumped into my throat as I scanned the room for her. There she was, standing at the foot of the platform. I only saw her for just a moment before I heard the rumble of the train and watched her fall face forward onto the tracks. The train came with a horrible crunch, and it felt as if I was there with her on the tracks. All of my breath leaving my body, I stood paralyzed as I realized we'd lost her. We don't know any of Dottie's family, and there wasn't much of a body to bury. At least that's what Cooper said. I couldn't bear to look. After the police came and hosed down the tracks, scraping up her remains unceremoniously, we held a small memorial service for her. We gathered up the things she loved, her lavender lipstick, root beer flavoured candies, and put together a few dollars to get the candles with the pictures of saints on them. We huddled together, the small group that we had left, and I prayed to a God I hadn't remembered in a long time. I don't know what they did to her at that career counselling meeting, but Dottie would never do that. She was sunshine. She was hope and the future, and everything wonderful melded into a ball of sweetness. And she would never lose hope, no matter what had happened to her. The only conclusion that I can draw is that she was not acting of her own will. Please, if you have any information, let me know. I will try to check in when I have access to a computer again. I don't know what's going on at the homeless shelter, but I'm going to find out before they do this to anyone else. "1991. That was the year my parents moved into our house. It was quite small at first, but they built an entire new section, including a crawl space. The family that lived here before us had 3 sons, Tommy, Danny, and Gary. They had these shelves for all of them in the basement, all labelled with permanent marker. I recently took pictures, which you can see below, of the 3 shelves. I started searching in their boxes to see if I could find anything. My stepbrother and I were searching through all of them for 2 hours, but all we found were 3 boxes of bullets. There was one last box we hadn't checked. Don't ask why we were doing this, because I don't have a clue either. We were bored out of our minds, and then my stepbrother said, "Hey, let's go into the basement." And so we went down into the basement and started looking through boxes and such. Tommy's box was the one we hadn't checked. I reached my arms up so I could get a hold of it and brought it down. We looked through for a couple of seconds and found a doll. 2007. I was 8. My sister and I found the doll in the basement. It was a little porcelain doll, pale, very pale. It had blue eyes, but the pupils were white. It didn't have a dress, or feet for that matter. Its feet were broken off, and it really didn't look right. Its hair was blonde, and it felt very real actually. We had a neighbour. He was my friend, my sister's friend as well. We all would chase each other with the doll. It was just an innocent little game we would play sometimes. We called the doll Scary Lady. My mother would always bring it back down to the basement because she didn't want some dusty, old porcelain doll sitting around. Now, in this basement, there were 2 sections. The crawl space, which was right under the living room, and the actual basement that has been there for 50 years. And I mean basement. Not your typical finished basement that has a couch and all of that. This is the real deal, with all the brick walls surrounding loads of crap in the middle, with a stone cold floor of cement. 2014. I was brushing my teeth and I went over to the hallway upstairs and saw on top of a tall bureau the doll. I laughed quietly to myself as it brought back lots of memory from my early childhood years. I picked it up and put it on my bed. It was on my computer for a while, until I got curious and a little afraid. There was something off with the fact that it was up here, upstairs, not in the basement. I remembered that my mother would always put the doll back in the basement because she didn't want some dusty old porcelain doll laying around the house. Why was it up here? I asked my mum, and she replied saying that she doesn't know what doll I'm talking about. "You mean you don't remember?" I asked. "No, although there was that one doll you guys would always leave on the floor in the hallway," she replied. "Okay, so why did you bring it back up?" I asked. "No, I haven't seen the doll in years," she said. About 1 week later, I was pouring myself a glass of water, but the sink wasn't really working great. When I tried to twist the handle, it started spitting water out slowly, then fast, in that pattern. I figured it had to do with our filter, since it's old as this house. So I went down to the basement, and the filter was the issue. I just had to twist something a little bit because it was loose, therefore causing that weird spitting pattern. I thought, while I'm down here, I could just kind of look around for a minute, mainly because I haven't been down here in a while. I looked into the crawl space. It looks like something out of a horror movie, my mother would sometimes say. And for just a second, just 1 second, I imagined the doll, all the way in the middle of the crawl space. I gasped at the thought. Seriously, I could see it in my mind. It would look just perfect, like it lived there. The thought of it staring down at me from that spot is just terrifying. I really wanted to see this. I always loved scary things, and this would be a great picture to have. So I went upstairs, grabbed the doll, and came down to the basement. I was going to go in the crawl space right there, but something stopped me. Something was telling me this was a bad idea. Like my mother would sometimes say about it, something out of a horror movie. That was very true. It did in fact look like it was in a horror film. A good horror film. A really good horror film. So I stood up on a stool and crawled into the crawl space. I started going faster as I really did not want to be in there. I put the doll in its place and went back to the old section of the basement. I took a second to catch my breath and looked back. "Ah, Jesus," I said. This was probably the most frightening thing I'd ever seen. The face of the doll staring down all the way to the old section was just horrifying. I took my phone out of my pocket and snapped a picture of it. I never went back in the crawl space. No, I don't want to see it, and I don't want it to see me. A couple days later, there is a difference between scary and creepy. In some cases, this was a creepy situation, but I find that this is more scary than creepy. There are too many dolls that have the ability to move, such as Robert the doll, who is also dangerous, mainly because they have something to do with spirits. This doll that I have in my basement right now, in that very spot of the crawl space, could be like those dolls, but it also might not be. I actually don't know. Well, what I do know is that this has been causing me a lack of sleep. All I can think of is the doll, just sitting there, staring down the crawl space. It belongs in there. Sometimes when my sister and I are watching a movie on the TV in our living room, I realize that the doll is right under us. Sometimes when I come back from school and I want to play the piano in the living room, I remember the doll is right under me. Sometimes when I go out the door in the living room, I remember the doll is right under me. It's very hard to get out of my head. It might be in the basement and not in the house, and it might not be haunted, but it's still the only thing I think about night and day. At some point, I'm going to go down there and throw the doll in the trash. It serves no purpose being here anymore. It's not even nostalgic to look at, because the only memory it'll make me think of is the one I'm living in. I want to show this to someone. My stepbrother, he'll be here in an hour. I can tell him about this. When he arrived. "Hey, come here," I said. "Oh hey, what's up?" he replied. "I need to show you something. Come with me." We walked down the stairs to the basement. I twisted the light bulb and walked over to the opening of the crawl space. I was walking backwards though, looking at him, telling him all about how I had found the doll on that bureau and how the sink wasn't working, so I went down to the basement. I turned around. "Where is it?" I said. "Where's what?" he replied. "The doll!" I yelled back at him. He was confused why I was mad. I wasn't. I was afraid. I know I hadn't told anyone but my mother about this doll, especially where I had put it, which was all the way down in the 30-foot long crawl space, which no one taller than 5 feet could crawl into. I started breathing a little faster, then a little faster. Of course, the question was not forgotten. I still ask myself this. Did it move? This story is straight from my father's mouth. His mother was a singer in Vegas, and she was probably one of the best. I never knew much about his childhood. He gave us the best growing up, and never asked for anything in return. We never asked questions because, well, when you grow up well, what's the point, you know? So Dad's childhood was a mystery to me, up until yesterday. Dad found out that he has a brain tumour a few months ago. It's inoperable. We'd been drinking together, sitting by the bonfire, while my own children ran through the darkness of our yard, playing and laughing. I don't know why he told me all of this. Maybe he didn't want to die with a secret. Still, I have entire faith that the following is true. This is the story from his point of view. My mom had always been beautiful. From the first memory, I just remember thinking how absolutely wonderful she always looked. Eyebrows always perfectly plucked, skin as smooth as a child's, lipstick bright red and never smeared no matter what happened. Of course, beauty doesn't make you a good parent. Love makes you a good parent. And I don't think she ever had love for anyone outside of herself. In all honesty, my sister Tara and I weren't her birth children. Her own sister had given birth to twins at an extremely young age. She died not long after childbirth due to malpractice. Mom had no choice but to take us under her wing. She didn't necessarily want to. However, she knew she could sue the hospital for malpractice against her beloved sister and win much easier if she took us in. Made it look like she needed the money, which I guess she did. She won, of course. After that, Mom had a stroke of bad luck that followed her wherever she went for the first few years of my life. Jobs were hard to come by, and something told me that she knew she was getting older fast. She knew she was aging, and she hated it. It seemed like the more desperate she became, the worse things got. Then suddenly, when I was about 9, everything got better. Mom was happy. She looked more beautiful than ever. We suddenly had this house that was incredible. 3 stories with a grand staircase and more rooms than we'd ever need. Mom had a permanent job at a very popular casino, singing on stage at their bar. Now, that might not be a huge thing now, but at the time, it was like being a real star. There were parties, lots of parties. The most glamorous people of that time, in that place, came to our home. Of course, while it sounds like our childhood was grand, it really wasn't. There were things going on behind the scenes that no one could ever fathom. Mom never showed any kind of affection towards us that wasn't to make sure everyone thought she was the perfect parent. When she looked at us, there was no love in her eyes, no hate, no sadness, just blankness. We were there, and the only time she ever really paid us any attention was when we were in the way. We weren't allowed outside of our rooms more than to take meals, bathe, or play outside. We had a nanny who homeschooled us. Hell, I never set foot in a real school until my late teenage years. There were rooms we weren't allowed in at all. Then there was the attic. We were never allowed anywhere near there. And even now, I think she had a good reason for keeping us away. It started about a year after we moved into the house. Laughter, Dark, evil laughter like nothing I'd ever heard before. It would start in the middle of the night and go until near daybreak. It wasn't loud, but it always seemed like it was right in your ears. Bringing this up to Mom was useless. Nanny heard it too, but she seemed to take Mother's side. I guess I got that. Don't go against the one who pays you. It was torturous at times, nearly impossible to tune out. But you learn with time. Then something came down from there. Only at night, only when Mom was sleeping. The first time I saw anything, I was probably 10 or 11. I got up in the middle of the night to go use the restroom, which was just across the hall. However, at the end of that very same hallway, there was the attic door. Every day it stayed closed, locked. That night, it stood open, and something stood halfway in the door and half out into the light of the hallway. Despite that light, it was black. Black as darkness, black as death. White eyes adorned the face. Too large, too far apart. No other features, just those white, wide eyes, seeing me, seeing nothing. The laughing that I'd come to know so well came from it, despite the fact that it had no mouth. It stayed there for a long time, before slipping back behind the door, which closed with a click. I told Mom, I told Nanny, I told Tara, I told the strangers at the parties. No one would listen. And so it went on, for longer than I'd like to say. That thing terrorized me. At night, it would walk around the house. Sometimes, it'd just stand in the open doorway and stare. Other nights, it'd stand right over my bed, staring at me with those awful eyes. It'd caress my face with disgusting, long fingers that smelled of curdled milk. That's something you never learn to live with and ignore. Around the time I turned 12, work started to dwindle for Mom. Our bills were behind. Then she found out that she was pregnant and lost the job entirely. She was a mess. I remember seeing her cry when I was little, but never after things started looking up. She cried all the time then. I remember overhearing her talking to Nanny about wanting an abortion. A few nights later, I saw her go up in the attic. I'd only ever seen her go once before, with a young woman from one of her parties. She came back down with a much lighter look on her face. The next day, she announced to us that she would go through with her pregnancy. The bills got paid. Mom opted to stay indoors. Nanny did everything for her. Hell, she even gave birth at home. A little girl. Just like that, though, she was gone. Mom told all her friends about how she had adopted her baby out to an older couple up north. But I knew better. I watched her take the crying newborn up to the attic the night after she was born. I heard the cries, the screams, the silence. Then the laughter. Mom got a new job at an even better casino. And just like that, everything seemed normal. She worked, the parties resumed, the laughing monster stayed in its place. I felt so selfish for it, but I was glad for what she did in a way. I could sleep again. I could eat again. I felt normal for the first time in years. And then it came back, and it was so much worse. It didn't just stand there. It spoke with no mouth. It said awful things I'd never repeat to anyone. The eyes stared as the words slipped out, slurred from nowhere I could see. I wanted to die then. At 14 years old, I wanted it all to just end. With no one listening to me and no one caring, I started acting out. It just started with running away in the middle of the night. I'd stay gone until 3 or 4 in the morning. At first, just going on walks. We didn't live too far from a lot of bars and diners and shops, places where kids hung out. Those same kids got me into drinking and smoking, among other things. Meanwhile, things were going bad for Mom again. They hired on a much younger singer. Even with her look, her age was showing. She seemed so desperately depressed all the time. The last night we lived in that house, I was sneaking out as I normally did. I peeked out of my door, but I wasn't met with a normal quiet. I heard crying coming from down the hall, from Mum's room. It wasn't her voice crying though. It was Nanny's. Then I heard a thump and silence. I closed the door just enough so I could see out of the crack as Mum dragged Nanny's unconscious body out of her room, down the hall, and to the attic door. She closed it behind her, and I listened to the thump, thump, thump of the unconscious woman being dragged up the stairs. I cried then. I knew exactly what was going to happen. This time though, there was no sound from the attic for a while, until I heard Mum's voice. She was yelling at someone, yelling in between tears. Frantic footsteps started down the attic stairs and into the hallway. I closed the door as quietly as I could and tiptoed to my bed. I pretended to be asleep as Mum peeked in, only for a moment, before closing the door quietly behind her and running frantically back down the hallway. It was quiet for a while, but I didn't dare move. There was no laughter coming from the attic this time, and I remember wondering to myself if something had gone wrong. Then I smelled the smoke. The rest of that night went so fast. The entire hallway was filled with flames. The attic door was left wide open, and that thing stood in the doorway. Even with the bright light of the flames, it was still black and featureless. A horrid, inhuman scream came from somewhere inside the monster. It pointed at me as it screamed, but I started running before I could see whether or not it was actually making chase. I looked into Mum's room, but she was gone. Her king-sized bed, along with the canopy above, was up in intense flames. I ran to Tara's room and woke her up. From there, we climbed down the best we could from the awning outside her bedroom window, as the stairs were on the other end of the hallway, where the flames were at their worst. Mum was arrested that night. Arson was the only charge. They assumed the 3 bodies in the attic perished in the fire. However, it was a different time. No one believed she could have been capable. After all, she was a woman. She was a beautiful woman. They assumed she was too dumb to start a fire. Can you imagine that? They let her go. But she died only a few months later. She just withered away. I don't even think the doctors today could explain it, although I'm sure they'd slap a label on it, but it would only be to hide their own incompetence. There just wasn't an explanation. When she killed that thing, its absence took her. Despite the fact that I know that thing is dead, I still wake up in the middle of the night expecting to see it standing over me. Those wide, white eyes staring, the laughing coming from nowhere. I asked my dad later whether or not he was afraid of dying. Oh no, I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of what might be waiting for me on the other side. Let me preface this by saying I've never been one to believe in anything paranormal. I don't believe in ghosts, I don't believe in demons, I'm not overtly religious, I don't believe in cryptids like Bigfoot, Chupacabra or Nessie either. I do believe in aliens, but only because I firmly believe it's a mathematical impossibility that we're alone. However, something has happened that I simply cannot explain, and I believe I know what caused it, but proving it will be something else entirely. I'll start from the beginning. I don't party that frequently. It's just not my thing. I'd rather sit at home and play some games, or just have an evening out with my girlfriend. Crowds make me nervous, and I don't socialise well with others outside of work. Which is odd considering I'm in sales and socialising is a key part of my job. But last week, Steph talked me into going out with her. A co-worker of hers was attending some big rave, and Steph is all about new experiences. After an hour of driving through unoccupied countryside and back roads, we arrive at a large, abandoned barn. Thinking back now, it should have struck me as odd that it was abandoned and looked in such good condition. But my social anxiety was kicking in, and I was more focused on acting like a normal, party-going human being. Flash forward about 2 hours, and several drinks later, and we were hanging out in a small group of people off to the side of the dance floor, which is more just a jumbled square of drunk people who might as well have been having sex while dancing. In the midst of conversation, a random girl appears. She was maybe in her mid-20s, with dirty blonde hair, skeletally thin with sunken eyes. My drunken mind figured she was just on something, as this was a rave after all, and drugs were being passed around like candy. I did take notice that her clothing seemed oddly conservative. She was wearing black jeans, a plain black shirt, and a black hoodie, zipped up about halfway. "Do you have a phone I can borrow?" she asks. Her voice sounded odd, almost like a growl, but plenty of people have abnormal voices. Without thinking, I responded affirmatively and handed her my iPhone. She grabbed at it eagerly and wandered away a short distance. I turned back to my friends and continued my conversation. After a couple of minutes, I glanced over at her, received a bit of a shock. She had the phone to her ear, was speaking to someone, and staring at me. Unblinkingly, with her eyes so focused, I felt like she was staring into my soul. It was extremely unnerving. We stared at each other for possibly 20 seconds like that, all the while her still talking away. After about 10 seconds, I realized that the side of my head, around my ear but on the inside, was tingling and stinging. It started as a minor annoyance and gradually progressed to outright pain until suddenly it disappeared at the same moment she broke eye contact with me and took the phone away from her ear. She slowly walked over, handed my phone to me, and with a slight smirk on her face, but no words, turned around and disappeared back into the crowd. Slightly freaked out by this point, I turned to Steph and told her we needed to leave. She gave me a puzzled look, but after seeing the expression on my face, which I can only imagine was pretty scared, grabbed her purse without another word and walked with me back to the car. We got back to the house and crashed out for the night. After waking up the next morning, I realized that having had a few drinks probably made me more paranoid than usual. After all, she was just a harmless girl. A little creepy, but harmless, right? Well, I don't know. Over the last week, my phone has been acting odd. sometimes Siri will fail to respond to commands. This is relatively new because I use Siri all the time. Once or twice, she's responded with the normal responses that make for invalid commands of, "I can't do that for you." Except these are commands she should recognize. I've also noticed my ears seem to be hurting a bit, but on the inside, almost like a pressure headache. It must just be an odd coincidence that it happens when I try and use Siri, but that's getting harder and harder to believe. I'm writing this though, because of something that happened last night. I was woken up about 3 in the morning. Steph was at her parents' house for the evening, so I was all alone. My ear was killing me. It felt like it was literally on fire. The pain was making my eyes water, and my phone was repeatedly making the beep beep sound it makes when Siri is activated. Once I got up from the bed, it stopped. But the screen was lit. I walked over and looked. It was on the Siri screen, and right there, on the screen, as plain as day, Siri's respond text read, "You've made a terrible mistake. You know that, right?" Waiting for a response. First update. I took the phone over to my local Verizon store this morning. I used to sell phones at this place a while back. One of my best friends manages it now. I had him look at it. Of course, you know how they say your phone always acts up until you take it to the store? Yeah, well, I'm no different. Nothing responded in any funny matter. Siri didn't activate on her own. I began to think maybe I imagined it trying to talk to me. After all, it was late. I was disoriented. I thought maybe I even dreamed it. Either way, he reset the phone, just in case it was glitched or something. I went home and took a nap, as I didn't sleep well at all after what I thought my phone had done the night before last. I woke up about 30 minutes ago. My shoes were on. I could have sworn I took them off before I fell into bed. But I was so tired I might have missed it. They have some mud on them. It got on my sheets. Add cleaning my sheets to the list of chores today. My pillow had some kind of odd black stain on it. It was sticky, like tar, but it stunk. Oh my god, it stunk. It's odd, but the only way I can describe that smell is like rotten fire. Like eggs that had gone bad and then been lit aflame. It made me gag. The source of it seems to have been my ear canal. But some kind of ear infection may explain why it's been hurting the last few days. That'll have to wait a few days though. I have more important things on my mind. I rolled over and grabbed my phone. I activated Siri so I could call Steph. And when I did, the most recent stuff from Siri popped up. There are no timestamps, but I don't remember any of this. Nobody has borrowed my phone today, and I most certainly didn't do this. I'm going to copy what's on here, from Siri and from whoever responded to her. Get up. I said, "Get up now," said Siri. "What do you want? What are you?" "In time, you'll find out. For now, you're going to have to do something for me." "My head hurts. What is going on?" "Relax. Let me in. It'll make the pain stop." "You can make it go away?" "It's because you won't let me in that it hurts in the first place. Just make it stop." And that's it. The conversation ended after that. There comes a point where you cannot try to rationalize things and explain them away anymore. Something is wrong. I know this. Something I can't comprehend is happening. All I know is that the pain in my head has increased tenfold. My eyes are watering just laying here. It's difficult to think, but I have drawn one conclusion. I've been thinking about that girl who borrowed my phone. Something didn't seem right with her. She was wearing clothing that was completely out of the theme for the party. It was a rave. She was dressed like the goth chick you knew in high school. And thinking back, her clothing looked really ratty, worn and dirty, like it hadn't been washed in some time. I know it's some kind of pipe theory, but I keep thinking about how well maintained that abandoned barn looked. Does she live there? This all started after she borrowed my phone. And this all seems to be emanating from that damn device. Maybe I should drive back out there, see if I can find her, or any kind of clue. Second update. It's morning, finally. I've been barricaded in my room for some period of time. I don't really remember when. Time is kind of fluid to me right now. I've been blacking out periodically, but I always woke up somewhere else. I'm not stupid. I'm sure I'm being possessed or controlled or something like that. Whatever it is doing it is smart enough to not wake me up in any place that I could even remotely glean an idea of what's going on. I'm always in a park or in an alley. My blackout episodes, they come and go in spurts. The calendar says it's only been about a day and a half since my last episode. But I check that on the phone, and I'm no longer inclined to trust anything it says. I can fight it from taking control if I want, but this is when the earaches and headaches start. Eventually, I have to give in. The pain just becomes too much. Sometimes I can go a couple hours, sometimes only a few minutes. When I do give in, it takes over. I've been in my room and fighting it off for a record 5 hours right now. It talks to me quite frequently now. Even if what it says most of the time is horrifying, I'm getting used to it. I find it comforting. How strange is that? I know I'm beginning to go insane. I'm sure you people are going to be freaked out. But you know what? Good. You should be scared. I don't know why it chose me, but it has big plans. Bigger than me. Bigger than any of you. If this thing has its way, we will all die screaming. I hear it in my head now, but it's the strangest thing. The conversations still appear on my phone screen, and it's occasionally branched out to other forms of electronics. My computer turned on about 20 minutes ago. It opened Skype on its own. A video call initiated. Whatever it was I spent a few minutes talking to looked like me, but its eyes were black, completely, all the way to the edge of the eyeball. And when it spoke, it sounded like several voices all saying the same thing at the same time. I don't remember what we discussed, but it was shortly after that I unplugged the computer from the wall. Powering the phone down does no good. It just turns itself back on. Oh, right, why I am barricaded in my room. That answer is simple. The girl is in my house. Except I don't think she is a girl anymore, if she ever was in the first place. The thing in here with me wants to get out there to her. I can sense it. It hurls obscenities at me from the phone whenever she comes to my door. She never tries to force entry though. She just stands on the other side. I can hear her footsteps come up and stop right outside. She responded once or twice, but it was in a language I don't understand. Maybe Latin? She followed me back from the farm. I went out there to investigate, for all the good it did. What's happening was going to happen regardless. But now I have an idea of why. I think that maybe worse overall, ignorance is bliss. When I arrived there, it was about 9 PM last night. There were lights on inside, so I walked in. I had been mad. I was tired of being frightened. I wanted answers. Inside, the main large room was in a similar state to when we left the rave, though entirely absent of people. After a little digging around, I found a ladder going down into a basement. Being a stubborn, foolhardy son of a gun, I went. When I reached the bottom, I turned around and saw the strangest sight. She was sitting in the middle of a medium-sized room, cross-legged on the floor with her back to me, completely naked. Circling around her was an odd array of electronic objects on tables. Computers, tablets, printers, cell phones. All of them were floating a few inches off the table, facing her, and all of them were saying different things. Some in languages I didn't understand, some in English. I caught a couple sentences from a tablet and a cell phone near me. Not long now, not much longer. Soon we rise. Pain, yes, we love it, we want it. Torture you, hurt you, make you scream, make you cry. Suddenly, every device slammed to the ground and shattered. Her head jerked up, and slowly turned around while her body remained motionless. Her eyes, they were as black as night. She grinned at me. Black, tar-like ooze seeped out from between her teeth. When she spoke, it was in a voice like no human I've ever heard. Low, guttural, almost animal-like. I expected her to explain what was happening to me, but she wouldn't, or couldn't. Instead, she just kept repeating, "Not long now, not long now, closer he comes, closer, closer, almost here, almost here." As she was repeating this, I felt the thing in me and in my phone become elated. It liked what she was saying. Suddenly, her face took on a shocked look. I noticed disturbances in the air, as if something unseen were rushing at her from all angles. Her voice began to take on many layers, as if many things were talking at once, all from her. I ran. I made it back here, knowing she was behind me the whole way. I barricaded myself in here. I'm updating this from my phone. It must want you people to hear, because it hasn't stopped me. But the pain is becoming too much. I'm going to have to give in at any moment. I don't know what happens from here. We shall see. It's going to take over at any moment. I want you to know, whatever happens, I didn't intend to cause harm. I'm sorry.
Null est ubique, avies omnia sine, omnibus, abic tua esc, usque, et tempus, vos non postestis pugneri, ligio enim sumus, nos autumn multis sumus. Nos autumn multis sumus.
Being a single 38-year-old father of a 13-year-old is quite the challenge, but my son, Jared, has made it far too easy for me. He was the poster child of a good child. He never got into any trouble, excelled in every subject in school, and had a passion for the classical guitar. Of course, just like any other kid, he would do something wrong, but he was always honest with me. He would tell me what he did, and he would always seem legitimately sorry for his actions. That is why I was browsing through Craigslist looking for an Xbox One. I knew he wanted one, but it was far too expensive for me to buy. I could barely keep up with the bills, but I checked for a decent deal every night before I went to bed. "4 days ago, I came across a new ad placed for an Xbox One with 4 games for just $75. When I clicked on the ad, I saw that an enraged mother was selling her son's game system because he failed in all of his classes. After checking the time and seeing that it was 8:30 p.m, I called the number that was on the bottom of the post. 10 minutes later, we agreed to meet at my house at 10 a.m. the next day to make the transaction. Before she hung up the phone, she said, "I just want you to know something. My son, he's a smart kid, and he is a really good boy, but ever since he got that stupid system, he started getting obsessed over a game. I don't really know which one, but just monitor your son." I hung up the phone with an uneasy feeling, but I knew that my son was different. He deserved it. When my son came home from school, he screamed out in joy when he saw me hooking up his new Xbox to the TV. He ran up and gave me a hug and sat right next to me while I connected the HDMI cable to the system. I handed the controller to Jared and he started looking through the games. Once he picked out some sort of car racing game, I got up and started getting dinner ready. By the time I put together the last chicken taco, I turned around to call out to Jared to come in, but I saw he was already sitting on his chair. The whole entire meal, Jared thanked me for getting him the Xbox and about how his first couple races went. When we finished dinner, he got up and walked into his room. After I cleared out the dishes and washed them, I walked upstairs to my room. And when I passed by his room, I checked in and saw that he was closing up his school notebook and picking up his guitar. I had to get up early for a meeting the next morning, so I fell asleep as soon as I walked into the room to the sound of my son strumming out for Elise. The next couple of days went by smoothly. My son would come home, play on the Xbox for about an hour or two, eat dinner with me, and then do his homework and practice his guitar before going to bed. 2 days ago, everything changed. My son looked through his games, but after a couple of seconds, he started going through the menu of the Xbox. I told myself to make sure I had some new games before next week. I made chicken soup that night, but when I was done making it, my son was not sitting in front of the dinner table like he always was. After I called out to him about 3 times without a response, I walked out of the kitchen and into the living room. He was completely fixated on a game I hadn't seen him play before. It was just a yellow ball on the far right corner of the screen. There were smaller, grey balls flying towards the yellow ball that I guess you try to avoid. I tapped on Jared's shoulder, but he ignored me and kept playing the game. He never did this before, so I just took his dinner out to the living room and placed it next to him. I told him to eat it whenever he felt like it. I never really worried about him. He always did the right thing. The next day was Saturday too, so I decided to let him play the game for as long as he wanted. After I finished my dinner, I gave Jared a kiss on the forehead and walked to my room. I was used to falling asleep to the sound of his music, but the fast-paced rhythmic tapping on his controller slowly guided me to sleep. I woke up at 5 a.m. yesterday morning. The first thing I noticed was that I could still hear the sound of tapping. The second thing I noticed was that the tapping was completely in rhythm. Not a single tap was out of the beat that filled the otherwise silent house. I got out of bed and walked downstairs. Jared was still sitting in front of the TV. I tapped him several times, but he did not take his eyes off of the screen. I looked him in the eyes to get his attention, but the glazed look in his eyes made me start to panic. His eyes were a solid green. It wasn't the lighting or anything on the screen. His eyes were solid green. Without any hesitation, I grabbed the controller out of his hands and started to drag him to his room. He screamed and tried to get out of my grip, but I didn't loosen my grip until he was in his room. Through his tears and his screaming, he crawled to his bed and fell asleep. Curious, I went downstairs and picked up the controller. It was on the start menu, so I just clicked on the option that said Start New Game. I played it one time. Just once. But it is taking all of my willpower to not play again. I know it's not good. It's called Desires Unknown. If you happen to come across the game, please do not play it. It has taken up almost all of my thoughts. What does the game do? When you start the game, you are the dot on the far right side. Not just a pixelated version of you. No, a real-life version of you. The grey dots that fly towards you. Everything that you ever wanted. The first couple of dots were my favourite foods. Lasagna, steak, roast beef and spaghetti. But as the dots progressed, it soon became my son graduating from an Ivy League college. My wife surviving past the first 3 hours of Jared's birth. And the promotion that would allow me to spend more time with Jared without having to worry about finances. It took me everything to avoid all of the temptations. But I'm afraid to play again. I'm afraid to find out what happens if you fall for any of the temptations. I can't remember. The other car came out of nowhere. Connor will relay mechanically in his disassociated state, stitching together his fragmented memories for the police report after the accident. He will stare at the scene of the crash, glancing at each piece of scattered shrapnel, reflecting his broken thoughts. The lights from the cruisers, ambulances, and noisy rubberneckers will cause his head to throb, adding to the chaos of his universe. Eventually, the shock will pass, and he will collapse to his knees on the cold pavement in agony, grief overwhelming him. One vision will burn into his psyche, silencing the growing cacophony of his own thoughts. A seemingly innocuous item which will fester in the back of his mind until he ended his own life many years later. A bright yellow bumper sticker. Earlier that evening, Connor was enjoying a late, quiet autumn drive with his wife, Megan, down a lonely residential road. He was admittedly dizzy from the last night's festivities out with their mutual friends, but he insisted he was sober enough to take the wheel. Despite his assurances, he pressed the accelerator a bit harder than usual, hoping to make it home before any cops had a chance to complicate his evening. The couple sat in silence, entwining their hands between them, falling under the spell of the rhythmic strobe of passing streetlights. Megan kept her eyes trained out her window at the changing leaves, squeezing her spouse's hand intermittently. Connor ogled her with a lazy, drunk smile on his face. Turning back to the road, he snapped out of his hypnotic state and slammed on the brakes in response to the quickly approaching taillights which threatened a meeting with the front of their own car. "Jesus!" Connor spat as he and his wife lurched forward. Where the hell did this joker come from?" he cried aloud. He hadn't noticed any car ahead of them when he looked at the road only seconds before. A feeling of anger rose within him as his pleasant evening drive was interrupted by overcautiousness. "Honey, you need to relax. You were going too fast," Megan said matter-of-factly. "Yeah, well, this idiot is going slower than 30. There's no one around. Speed up," Connor shouted, as if the newcomers could hear him. The driver ahead showed no signs of hearing his demand and continued to cruise at a glacial pace. Connor took note of the "baby on board" sticker on the bumper, a bumper which had caved in, most likely from another car slamming into its slow backside. He rolled his eyes, knowing his car had the same sticker on its bumper. Earlier, he protested putting it on the car he shared with his wife, but Megan had been adamant about it. "Why would you want to advertise having a kid, especially with potential kidnappers everywhere?" Connor reasoned, but Megan insisted other motorists would drive more carefully around them, knowing they had a child in the car. Connor felt the collapsed bumper of the other car as evidence of the contrary. He kept this thought to himself. Connor leaned on the horn and flashed his high beams. As he did so, he noticed there was a passenger in the car. Two figures faced ahead, neither turning their seat to acknowledge the noisy car behind them. They didn't pull over to the side. Instead, they continued at their leisurely speed. "Seriously? They're going to pretend we're not here? Come on!" Connor honked a few more times, but there was still no reaction from the other car. He took their indifference as insolence, which ignited his anger into rage. "You're getting angry for no reason," Megan said coolly. "We need to let the babysitter go. I'm not paying him for an extra hour." White-knuckling the steering wheel, Connor swerved to the oncoming lane, and before he could floor the accelerator, the car had merged into the other lane swiftly along with them. The car remained in front of Connor and his wife, blocking their advance. Seething, Connor yelled, "What the hell is this guy's problem?" "It's obviously some kids messing with us. Let's just stay calm and not give them the satisfaction of riling us up. Forget the babysitter, we'll be home shortly," Megan soothed. Connor wasn't having it. Now he was hell-bent on either passing the pair in front of them or cornering them and beating their asses. The liquor fueled his bravado. He maneuvered back to the right lane, but the car matched his path exactly. The ease of their maneuvers confirmed Connor's suspicions that the occupants of the other car had harassed other drivers before. Wanting to get away from the nuisance, Connor tried to think of another way to bypass the other car. Unfortunately, the road which they travelled didn't branch off anywhere to get around the offending vehicle. Their only chance was at the end of the road, where there was a red light for a T intersection. However, that light was still a few miles away, and Connor's patience was wearing thin as the other car continued its deceleration. Determined to circumvent the sluggish car, Connor tried one more ploy. This time, he swung to the left, cut short, and swung back to the right, hoping the other car would be caught off guard. They weren't. Instead, the other car seamlessly matched Connor's position, shifting left, then abruptly changing course back to the right lane. The way the other car matched their position struck Connor as odd. He hadn't noticed it before, but there was no hesitation from the other car. No split-second pause to consider Connor's next play. Their movements weren't that of a copycat. Rather, it was like they knew what he was going to do. Connor's brief feelings of confusion were overcome by his feelings of anger, and he responded to the other car's tricks in the most childish way he knew. He quickly flipped them the middle finger. He watched the shadowy figure driving the other car do the same. Again, there was no hesitation as the other driver's hand shot up along with Connor's. Wanting to test a theory, Connor allowed his hand to linger in the air longer than necessary, waiting for the unknown driver to put his hand down, but instead it stayed hovering in the air. Connor's anger subsided a bit. In its place, a sense of unease crept in. He unfolded his other fingers, twisted his hand to present an open palm to the open car, and gave a small wave. Connor, eyes widened, gawked, as the silhouetted hand of the other driver slowly formed an open palm, turned to face the windshield, and waved out to the empty road ahead of them. Every motion was in harmony with Connor's actions. The mild gesture sent a ripple of fear down Connor's spine. He yanked his hand back to the steering wheel and observed the other driver do the same. "Did you just see that?" Connor flinched at the edge of panic in his voice. "You waving at the guy you've been moaning about for the last 10 minutes? Yeah, I was there for that." Sarcasm tinted her voice. "No, there's something weird going on." He couldn't take his eyes off the mysterious figure. "He's just messing with you." "No, I'm not sure what's going on, but it's as if he knows what I'm going to do. I don't think we should be anywhere near this guy anymore." Connor's eyes darted around the empty road, hoping for some signs of life to provide help, or at least comfort, but it was only him, his wife, and the couple in the dented vehicle ahead of them. Megan noticed nothing, so Connor tried to push his worry aside, but he couldn't shake the feeling. They continued driving in silence. Connor's hands tightened their grip on the wheel, straining the skin along his knuckles. The tension increased with every passing minute, until the quiet was cut by the sound of Megan's phone ringing, which caused Connor to jump in his seat. Without turning, he felt her eyes on him, the same eyes she'd penetrate him with whenever he was overreacting. She reached into a bag and produced the phone. The phone pressed to her ear, and Connor gaped at the passenger of the other car, who also put something to their ear. He was certain now that he wasn't hallucinating everything. The anonymous pair were, somehow, mirroring Connor and his wife. Megan hung up and mentioned something about the babysitter, but Connor was too engrossed with the occupants in the other car to hear what she was saying. Fear began to sink in, thinking about whoever or whatever was in the other car. Both cars drove slowly for the remaining few miles of the road. A million things ran through Connor's mind. He worried that the pair in the other car were sociopaths, part of a cult, possibly gang members, and that him and his wife were involved in some unnerving gang initiation. He wanted to turn around, but that would mean driving miles back the way they came, and he was afraid the shady couple will turn to follow them, and that was worse than them having the lead. Mercifully, they came around a bend, which brought them to the red light at the T intersection. both cars stopped to wait for the light to change. When the light slipped to green, nothing happened. Connor and Megan waited for the other car's turn signal, but it never came. The two shadows stared ahead at the empty intersection, idling at the lights as if to dare Connor to give way first. He gnawed on his cheek, hoping the other couple would just speed off and that whatever was going on was just some horrible practical joke. But they didn't budge. "Why are they moving? The light is green," Megan asked her husband, confused. A few more seconds of the standoff, and Connor steeled himself to put a stop to whatever it was the dark couple was trying to do. Connor cautiously stretched his hand out to the back seat, fearing he might spook the shadow couple if he moved too quickly. He snatched the ice scraper from the floor. It was a poor excuse for a weapon, but he needed a defense in the case the other couple was dangerous, and with every second that passed, Connor became more convinced that they were. "Megs, I need you to stay in the car. Make sure you have 911 dialed on your phone and get into the driver's seat. In case something goes wrong, I want you to be out of here and calling them," Connor implored. "Connor, you're overreacting." She tried to calm him down, but she was visibly nervous. "Maybe so, but still, get into the driver's seat and put the car in reverse so you're ready to take off." She recognized the seriousness in his face and nodded. Connor took a deep breath to prepare for whatever he was going to face and opened the car door. He was surprised that nothing stirred within the other car. He stepped out into the cool night air and his wife slid into his seat. She closed the door behind him and locked it. Warily, Connor shuffled towards the driver's side of the sinister car and raised the ice scraper, clutching it tightly in both hands. His heart knocked against his ribcage. He caught an incomplete view of the front of their car, but noted it was similarly devastated as the back of the vehicle. He licked his lips, attempting to get strength into his voice, and barked to the occupants of the dented car. "I'm not sure what your problem is, but get the hell away from..." Suddenly, the car accelerated and shot across the intersection. Instead of turning, it plowed through the guard railing along the intersection. The sound of screeching metal on metal punctured through the night, and Connor watched the savage bumper and comical sticker of the other car disappear and plummet 100 feet into the vegetation below. Dumbfounded, Connor froze mid-step. A few seconds of his wife's shrieking finally coaxed him back from his shock. "Megs, call the police right now. Tell them someone drove off the road and may need help." He whipped his head to see her nod in compliance, but she shook terribly. The ice scraper lowered, and Connor ambled across the intersection. He loitered near the part of the barrier still intact. He hesitated before inspecting the scene, not wanting to see body parts or any mess that was down there. He breathed deep and peered over the cliff. There was nothing. Connor's eyebrows furrowed in confusion. He squinted harder to scrutinize the dark underbrush, but he could discern nothing. There was no glow from the taillights or glint of moonlight on the car's surface, and no sound of a constant blaring horn. The barrier was torn through, evidence that an object crashed through it, but that object somehow disappeared. Without glancing back, Connor called over his shoulder, "Megs, the car is gone." "What?" she shouted back. "There's no car." Connor spun around in time to witness an enormous semi-truck slam into the back of their car. Like a rocket, their little sedan and his wife inside bolted across the road. The gust of wind created by the car's speed was enough to blow him back and steal the air from his lungs. His eyes met his wife's terrified gaze for a heartbeat, her glossy green eyes wide and fearful. Then she disappeared over the edge. A moment of disbelief passed, then Connor roared Megan's name. He stalled, reluctant to look over the edge again. He had a small glimmer of hope that once again nothing would be at the bottom of the cliff. He agonizingly dragged his gaze back to the depths, and this time a car lay there in ruin, a crushed metallic heap at the bottom of the dark pit. Before he falls into shock, unable to think coherently, before the police arrived too late to save his wife, Connor noticed one thing: the unmistakable baby on board sticker, which clung to the remnants of the collapsed bumper on the back of their car. It was unsettling to him how familiar that bumper seemed. Her family had lived in that house, on that street, for as long as Ivana could remember. She had her birthday parties in that backyard and swung from the big tree in the front yard until the rope wore down and the metal creaked. Every Christmas morning, gathered on the floor before the tree, and every Easter they sat on the back porch and dyed eggs to fill with confetti and glitter. Their walls were covered in both old and new photos, some black and white, some faded sepia, and others from the weekend previous. It had always seemed to smell of her grandmother's flowery perfume and smoke from their small wood-burning fireplace. Not too big, but big enough, as her father always said. It was home, serving as the backdrop for every fond memory she held dear. Well, them and a less pleasant one. Having lived in that neighbourhood for so long, they had come to be close with almost all their immediate neighbours. To their left lived an elderly couple Ivana knew simply as Mr. and Mrs. Herrera, who always sat in rocking chairs in their netted enclosed porch, and to their right lived the Campbell family. The Campbells' house was painted a lilac colour, and their backyards were separated by nothing more than a chain-linked fence. It had a bigger front yard too, or at least it felt that way since they lacked bushes or trees, which in turn led to many afternoons spent playing tag there with the Campbell kids. The youngest of them was a girl, 2 years older than Ivana, named Elisa. The two were very close, and often walked to school with their arms linked as they tried to stomp on every puddle or kick as much snow off the sidewalk as they could. Elisa was at every one of her birthday parties without fail, and Ivana climbed over the fence to join every one of hers. They agreed that nothing could ever separate them, and someday they might even move away together. The best thing was, in their minds, the fact that their bedroom windows were both on the sides of their respective house facing each other. The two of them would sit in the windowsills, perched like birds, and spent many hours talking by writing on notebooks and holding them up for the other to see. They would get each other's attention late at night with a few flickers of a flashlight and revelled in the disobedience and perceived danger of it all should they be found awake. Gossip, homework answers, anything to preoccupy each other until they were too tired to stay awake. Ivana looked forward to it every night, especially on days when chores and schoolwork kept her out of the yard. Snowy and sick days were by far the worst, and she sought comfort in leaning against the glass with her flashlight in hand. Elisa was her best friend, and she loved her. Elisa, unfortunately, didn't stick around as long as she had planned. That warm summer morning, when the moving truck pulled up in front of the lilac house, the two girls were heartbroken. Neither had known that far in advance, and when the news had been broken to them, it was taken with a hopeless sort of sadness that came with the inevitable. It rained that afternoon, and Elisa stood in a window with a backpack over one shoulder, waving goodbye. She wasn't crying, and Ivana smiled back with as much reassurance as she could muster. After her friend had gotten into the car and drove away with all her family's belongings in tow, however, all she could do was cry into a pillow so nobody could hear. She was a big girl after all. "No, Mommy, it's okay. We're gonna call and write letters. She'll do it, she promised." The house was empty for a long while, growing weeds while remaining vacant and silent. They stayed out of the front yard and only went over to pick the "for sale" sign back up when it would fall over. Winter blanketed the house in snow that it was left untarnished by footsteps until spring. The lawn turned brown under the summer sun without someone to water in the evenings. School started back up again, and Ivana had only received one letter and 2 phone calls from her old friend. They didn't know what to talk about either time. She wouldn't have noticed the "for sale" sign go down if it wasn't for her brother Thomas's suspicious tendencies. Thomas had said it multiple times. He had seen people going in and out, but their parents insisted that they had been keeping an eye out and had seen nothing. When he pointed the now empty yard out to their father, he shrugged and suggested that maybe someone was moving in. They never saw a moving truck or the big spectacle that accompanied new tenants. The red pickup truck was just there one day. At first, it appeared that only one person had moved in. A man with a thick white mustache and thinning silver blonde hair would occasionally leave to go and buy groceries, and sometimes he would just pace the porch in the evenings with a beer can in one hand, wearing nothing but a wife beater and a pair of grimy jeans. He introduced himself reluctantly in passing once as Douglas. Ivana didn't like the way his gaze lingered on her when he noticed her standing there. Sometimes she would go out and swing, only to go inside promptly after noticing him in the window or looking out the screen door. He looked like he couldn't figure out what she was, like she was some unidentifiable animal prowling about the property. One late winter night, something else happened that she found unsettlingly odd. She lay in bed, half awake, when something in the window of Elisa's old room caught her attention. It was a tiny flicker, not like a flashlight, but more the reflection of light of something else. She sat up, convinced it was a trick of memory and light. The flickering was deliberate, a pattern of varying durations, and something was moving ever so slightly between the half-drawn curtains in the darkness of the supposedly vacant room. Sliding out from under the covers, she made her way to the window and cupped her hands around her eyes for a clearer look. The room wasn't vacant at all. A girl a few years younger than her stood almost out of sight with a compact mirror in her hand. She was using the glow of the street lamp and waved excitedly when she noticed. She moved forward and began mouthing something unintelligible as Ivana reached for a notebook in response. "Hey there, who are you?" The girl looked confused and didn't appear to understand either what was written or what the question was. She stared blankly at her a moment before she mouthed a simple question. "Name?" Ivana nodded, urging her to answer. She pointed to herself and mouthed Ivana as well as she could before pointing to the girl for her response. "Marissa." After a few tries, Ivana turned back to the notebook and held it up long enough for the girl to decipher. "It's nice to meet you, Marissa." Marissa nodded happily and smiled a wide, toothy grin. She was missing a few front teeth, but didn't seem to mind. Soon they would be back, seeing that adult teeth were beginning to peek out of her gums. It was nothing unusual for a child her age. She pointed out and then held up 2 fingers. The message was clear. "You too." Before she could write anything more, Marissa's head turned and she suddenly looked flustered. She turned back, only to wave before slipping back out of sight. This left Ivana slightly rattled, wondering if this was something normal or not. Some people were just shy, she knew, and she didn't want to make mountains out of molehills, but the encounter left her uncomfortable. It wasn't the last time Marissa appeared in the window. She would stand there waiting for a new friend to notice and come to the window. She only appeared at night at first, which allowed the "I'm tired, gotta sleep" half excuse to be used. Only the sad look on Marissa's face made her insides writhe with guilt. It was difficult to talk, since she never had any paper and wouldn't open the window because there was a house alarm installed, so the conversations were quite brief. The girl's voice was a mystery for the longest time. Soon she was there during the day too, which made things less unsettling and more uncomfortable. The window would slide open at around 9 in the morning, and if she were anywhere in sight, Marissa would call her name. Sometimes she threw little pebbles at the glass until she came to look. She spoke too fast and asked too many questions, which Ivana politely answered until an excuse popped up. It made her feel like a horrible sort of friend. "Do you have a dog? My dad's allergic to pet fur or something. What are you doing? Homework? Oh yeah, spelling is hard. Really hard. What took you so long to get home? Do you walk or ride the bus? I like the bus. You want to play something? I have lots of dolls. You want to come over and play? I have lots of games we could play." For someone with so many questions, however, there was one that she refused to answer herself, which made Ivana even more suspicious. One afternoon, while unpacking the necessary supplies to complete her homework, Marissa asked her what she did at school and continued to pry at details. Swallowing hard to push back the apprehensiveness, she turned and asked, "Where do you go to school, Marissa? I've never seen you at mine." The girl in the window looked as if she were suddenly put on stage with a spotlight on her face. "I used to go to a private school by Mom's house, but Daddy's been homeschooling me or something." "Really? Is it fun staying home?" "Sure, I guess." She tilted her head as if listening, then her eyes widened in surprise. "What's wrong?" "Nothing. My daddy's calling. See you later." That evening, she brought up Marissa to her parents. She told them everything about her, all the questions and the weird feelings she got. She admitted how she had been actively avoiding her and sneaking around so she wouldn't see her. At first, her parents didn't seem to worry, saying that their new neighbor was just a little nosy. Thomas seemed more interested, and she could tell by his face he was more curious than anything else. After dinner, he asked if he could see Marissa, and there wasn't any logical reason she should answer no. But when they tried to get her attention, they found that night she didn't come to the window. Tom made sure the window was locked before going back to his own room. A week passed, and they waited for the strange neighbor friend. A week passed, Marissa was nowhere in sight, and neither of them had any desire to go knocking on the door with Douglas inside. Maybe she's imaginary. I'm too big for imaginary friends. Finally, on a particularly cold evening, she saw the flicker from the window once again. The window was indeed open, but only enough for Marissa to whisper through. She looked alright, albeit a little tired. "Hey, Ivana, you want to see something cool?" "What is it?" "I made a pillow fort. It's really fun. It's got multiple little rooms. If you're sneaky, you could come over and we can play in it." "Why do I have to be sneaky?" "Daddy doesn't like people coming over. They make messes. You won't, but he thinks you will." "Where's the pillow fort?" "It's in the little crawl space under the living room floor. You wanna?" Ivana swallowed hard. "It's late, and I have school tomorrow. I gotta go to bed soon. I'm sorry." "It's okay. I just never have any friends over. It's like they forgot about me." Oh, I bet they didn't. Everyone's in school and I'll ask my mum tomorrow. Marissa cracked a little smile, and for a while they sat in silence. Is Douglas your dad? Ivana asked slowly, as if she were tiptoeing around. The little girl in the window made a face she hadn't before. Her brow furrowed, and she shook her head. Douglas? Yeah, he and my dad only talked a little. He doesn't seem to like neighbors much. That's not my daddy's name. Thomas wouldn't let such new information go, and spent more time trying to encounter Marissa himself. He asked questions like, does she look like him? Or, what else did she say about him? Still, there was no response whenever Thomas was present, even if he hid so she couldn't see him. This frustrated him greatly, and he continued to bring it up to their parents, only to be told to not spy on neighbors. At one point, he accused his sister of making it all up because she was upset about Elisa. On a chilly November morning, Ivana proved she wasn't making anything up. It was about 4:30, before the sun had begun to rise up into the grey winter sky. The entire family was awoken by the sound of glass shattering. She was the first to get up and figure out what had caused the noise, since all she had to do was peek out the window. The window Marissa had so frequently perched in had shattered outward, scattering shimmering shards of glass all over the weeds in the window well below. There, the dark-haired girl stood, her curly locks no longer in their neat braids, and her eyes wide with fear, or at least what she perceived to be fear. She was shaking her head, and when Ivana called her name, she looked around frantically, her eyes unfocused. I can't see, it's too dark, I don't want to be here, please. Marissa, I'm right here. What happened? She waved her arms, but the girl only groped around blindly. I don't want to go back into the dark place. It's not fun. It's not fun. There was another indistinct thud, and then her voice was gone. Everyone rushed in shortly after, but nobody could figure out what had happened or what she had even been talking about when she tried to articulate what she had seen. That afternoon, Ivana decided to call Elisa in hopes of telling someone who would better understand. She sat in a windowsill, looking out as she listened to the ringing in anticipation. Elisa's mother answered after 3 attempts, sounding irritated, before giving over the phone. Hey Ivana, how are you? Something weird is happening in your house. She went into detail, explaining what was happening, from the first night to that morning, and her old friend only listened in a nervous silence. It was only after Ivana mentioned Marissa's offer to join her in the crawlspace pillow fort that Elisa spoke up. Wait, she said she was playing in the crawlspace? She wanted me to go see it. It was under the living room floor. You've been to my house though. We have a basement just like yours. No crawlspace. Really? Oh yeah. It was then, while absent-mindedly staring out of the window, she noticed Douglas practically running from his house, hastily tossing ratty suitcases and bags into the back of his red truck. He was staring all around, as if afraid someone would sneak up on him, then jumped in and drove away. She went hopping down the stairs, eager to tell Thomas, only to find her father sitting on the couch, leaning forward to focus all attention on the news reports. Hey honey, isn't that... Her mother came running in, and they all stared in horror as the breaking news ribbon moved across the screen, and a photo of a man with a thick white mustache and silver blonde hair was put on screen. The local reporter spoke with grim urgency. Police are searching for 55-year-old Douglas Hume, who is the primary suspect in the murder of Sandra and Anthony Mitchell, as well as the abduction of their 7-year-old daughter. After neighbours reported a foul smell coming from the attached duplex where Hume had previously lived, police found the Mitchell's remains buried in the crawl space after having been missing for nearly 4 months. Police believe that Hume is tied to multiple robberies and abductions all over the state. He is considered to be armed and very dangerous. If you have any information concerning the whereabouts of Mr. Hume, please contact this number on screen. Ivana watched in shock as her mother snatched the phone from her hands and darted to the kitchen to dial the number